A 13-year-old boy stands in a crowded charity rally, shaking so hard his teeth chatter, not from the cold, but from the face he just recognized across the street. The man smiling for photographs came to his house last night, asked questions no stranger should ask, and now the boy's mother won't answer her phone. He grabs the leather sleeve of a scarred ex-Marine biker he's never met and whispers 7 words that will ignite a war no one saw coming. Because the man in that crowd isn't who this town thinks he is, and the boy who recognized him just became the most dangerous witness alive. What happens next will shatter everything. If this story hooks you, smash that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and stay all the way to the end, because this one doesn't let go. The morning the Freedom Ride rolled into Ashridge, the sky hung low and colorless like a sheet pulled over a dead man's face. November had stripped the mountain ridges bare, left the hardwood skeletal against a horizon that couldn't decide between rain and ice. The roads coming into town were cracked and patched so many times they looked like sutured skin, and the rumble of over 300 motorcycles shook the windows of every storefront along Main Street, hard enough to rattle the dust off picture frames nobody had touched in years. Ronan Voss felt the vibration in his molars before he heard the column behind him. 37 bikes from the Iron Vale MC alone stretched back in staggered formation, engines growling low through the mountain pass like something alive and restless underneath the asphalt. He rode point, always rode point, road captain for 11 years, ever since he came home from his 3rd deployment with a titanium plate in his left forearm and a silence inside his chest that no amount of highway wind could fill. He didn't wave to the crowd lining the sidewalks, didn't tip his chin at the kids holding small American flags. He scanned. That was what Ronan did. He watched doorways, rooflines, parked cars with fogged windows, hands that moved too fast or stayed too still. It was the thing the Marine Corps had welded into his nervous system, the inability to stop cataloging threats in every room he entered, every street he crossed. His therapist at the VA had called it hypervigilance. Ronan called it the only reason he was still breathing. The Freedom Ride was a charity rally, had been running for 9 years. Veterans, first responders, families who'd lost someone to a war most Americans had already stopped thinking about. Ashridge wasn't much, a town of 4,000 wedged between 2 ridgelines in Western Virginia, surviving on a gas station, a tractor supply, and the kind of stubborn pride that kept people from leaving even when every economic indicator said they should. The rally brought money. The rally brought noise. For 1 weekend a year, Ashridge pretended it wasn't dying. Ronan had attended every single one since the first. Not for the crowd, not for the barbecue or the speeches or the politicians who showed up to shake hands they'd never shake again until the next election. He came because his younger brother, Corporal Danny Voss, had been killed 7 years ago during a convoy ambush outside Kandahar. Danny had been 23. He'd had a crooked smile and a habit of singing off-key country songs during long patrols, and he had believed, with a sincerity that made Ronan's throat close even now, that serving meant something. The Freedom Ride had been Danny's idea. Danny never got to see the first one, so Ronan came, every year, parked his bike at the same spot near the old courthouse, wore Danny's dog tags under his vest, spoke to no one about why his jaw clenched every time someone thanked him for his service. The Iron Vale set up near the food tents on the south end of the rally grounds. Ronan killed his engine and swung off the Harley, boots hitting gravel with the flat, heavy sound of a man who carried weight that wasn't physical. He pulled off his gloves 1 finger at a time, slow, deliberate, the way a surgeon might remove something sterile. His hands were scarred, knuckle scars from bar fights he'd lost in the years after Danny died. A long white line across his right palm from a piece of shrapnel the field surgeon had missed the first time. Voss, a voice behind him, low, careful. He turned. Jude Callahan stood 3 bikes back, already off his machine, helmet tucked under one arm. Jude was the club's sergeant-at-arms. 6'4", shoulders like a loading dock, face weathered into something that looked carved from sandstone. He had a prosthetic left leg below the knee. IED, Helmand Province, 2011. He never talked about it. The only people who knew were the brothers who'd been in the room when he learned to walk again. "You eat today?" Jude asked. Coffee. That's not food. It's close enough. Jude stared at him the way he always did when Ronan was running on fumes and pretending otherwise. The two men had known each other for 14 years, long enough that silence between them carried more information than most people's conversations. Jude didn't push. He just stood there, a wall of denim and leather, until Ronan finally exhaled and moved toward the food line. The rally was already thick with people by 10. Local vendors selling kettle corn and smoked ribs, a bluegrass trio playing on a flatbed trailer, kids running through the crowd with faces painted like flags. The VFW had a booth. The volunteer fire department had a booth. The county sheriff's office had a booth manned by two deputies who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. And then there was the other booth. It was clean. Too clean. White tablecloth, printed banners, glossy brochures stacked in perfect rows. The sign read, Hail Foundation, Building Futures for Veterans and Families. A man stood behind the table with the kind of smile that belonged on a billboard. White teeth, pressed polo shirt, handshake already extended before you were close enough to take it. Ronan noticed him immediately. Not because of the smile, because of the eyes. The smile didn't reach them. It sat on the man's face like something rehearsed, something applied, the way you'd apply a coat of paint over a wall you didn't want anyone looking through. The man was mid-40s, fit, clean-shaven, wearing a watch that cost more than most of the cars in the parking lot. He moved through the crowd like a politician, touching elbows, leaning in close, laughing at the right moments, but his gaze kept tracking, scanning the same way Ronan scanned. Except this man wasn't looking for threats. He was looking for something else entirely. Ronan filed it away. The way he filed everything. A mental folder labeled wrong that he kept open at all times. He took a plate of food he didn't want and sat on the tailgate of a pickup truck parked at the edge of the grounds. Jude sat next to him. Neither spoke. The mountains stood around them like old men with nothing left to say, and the wind carried the smell of wood smoke and diesel and the faint chemical sweetness of funnel cake from a vendor across the lot. That was when the boy appeared. He came from behind the VFW booth, walking with the particular kind of caution that Ronan recognized instantly, the measured steps of someone trying not to be noticed, 13 maybe. Thin, brown hair too long, pushed behind ears that stuck out slightly, jeans with holes at both knees, a jacket that was a size too big. He carried a paper plate with a single hot dog on it, but he wasn't eating. He was watching. Ronan tracked the boy's eyes. They moved through the crowd the way a deer's ears rotate in a clearing, constant, alert, calibrated to threat. This wasn't the natural wariness of an introverted kid. This was learned behavior. This was a child who had been taught by circumstance that the world contained things that could hurt him, and the only defense was to see them before they arrived. The boy stopped. His body went rigid. The paper plate tilted in his hand, and the hot dog slid to the ground, but he didn't notice. His eyes were locked on something across the crowd, fixed with the terrible stillness of recognition, the kind of recognition that carries dread attached to it like a hook buried in flesh. Ronan followed the boy's gaze. The man from the clean booth, the white teeth smile, the expensive watch. The man was laughing, shaking hands with a local council member, posing for a photograph with his arm around someone's shoulder. He radiated warmth the way a space heater radiates warmth. Mechanical, temporary, with a switch that could be turned off at any moment. The boy started trembling. Not the dramatic shaking of a movie, something quieter, worse. A vibration that started in his hands and traveled up his arms into his shoulders. A frequency of fear that Ronan had only seen in combat zones, in civilians who'd just watched something happen that couldn't be undone. Ronan set his plate down slowly. He didn't move toward the boy. Moving toward a frightened child too quickly was the fastest way to make them run. He stayed still. He waited. The boy's eyes shifted. Found Ronan. Held. Something happened in that exchange that neither of them could have explained. The boy saw the leather vest, the scars, the flat expression, the posture of a man who'd spent years in places where softness got you killed, and instead of running, he took a step closer. Then another. Then he was standing 3 feet from Ronan's left boot, and his hand reached out and grabbed a fistful of leather sleeve, and the words came out in a whisper so thin it almost dissolved in the wind. I know that face. He came to my house yesterday. Ronan didn't react, not outwardly. Inside, something shifted, a gear engaging, a mechanism turning over, the cold clarity that descends when the body recognizes danger before the mind catches up. He kept his eyes on the boy, didn't look toward the man, didn't give any indication that anything had changed. "What's your name?" Ronan asked. His voice was low, steady, the tone of a man asking someone to pass the salt while a building burned behind him. "Eli." The boy's grip on his sleeve tightened. "Eli Mercer. Eli, I need you to look at me, not at him, at me." The boy's eyes snapped to Ronan's face. Up close, Ronan could see the dark circles underneath them, the bruised, hollow look of a child who hadn't slept properly in longer than one night. There was something older in those eyes, something that didn't belong in a 13-year-old, a knowledge that the world was not the safe place adults kept promising it was. "He came to my house," Eli repeated. "Yesterday. He said he was from some foundation, scholarships or something. He was asking about my dad, about who lives in the house, whether my mom, whether she's alone." The last word cracked. Alone. It carried the weight of something this boy understood too well. Ronan's peripheral vision caught movement. Across the crowd, the man, the one with the expensive watch, had stopped laughing. He wasn't looking at the council member anymore. He was looking at Eli. And even across 60 yards of crowd and noise, Ronan saw the shift. The smile vanished like a light going out. Something colder replaced it. A calculation, an assessment. Then the man turned and walked away. Not fast, not panicked. The controlled, unhurried departure of someone who had practiced disappearing from rooms without being noticed. "Jude," Ronan's voice hadn't changed pitch, hadn't changed volume. But something in the frequency made Jude set his plate down immediately. Gray polo, expensive watch, moving east through the food vendors. Don't approach, don't engage, just eyes. Jude stood, and despite his size, a man who should have been impossible to miss, he slid into the crowd like a shadow stitched to the pavement. Ronan looked down at Eli. The boy was still holding his sleeve. His knuckles were white. "Where's your mom, Eli?" "Home. She said she'd come to the rally later, but she didn't want to leave the house this morning. She was scared. She wouldn't tell me why, but I could hear her locking the back door twice. She never does that." Ronan pulled out his phone. "What's her number?" Eli recited it from memory, the way children memorize emergency information they hope they'll never need. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Ronan waited 30 seconds and dialed again. Voicemail. He tried a 3rd time. Nothing. The silence on the other end of that phone line was louder than the 300 motorcycle engines that had shaken Ashridge awake that morning. It was the kind of silence that carried a shape, a presence, the outline of something wrong that hadn't yet been named. "She always answers," Eli said. His voice was small. "She keeps her phone on the counter. She always answers when I call." Ronan looked at the boy, really looked at him, saw the fear, saw the exhaustion, saw the desperate, half-formed hope that this stranger in leather and scars might be something the world hadn't been lately. Safe. He didn't make promises. Ronan had stopped making promises the day Danny's body came home in a flag-draped box. Promises were debts you might not live to pay. But he said, "Show me where you live." Eli stared at him. "Why would you help me? You don't know me." Ronan stood. His full height, 6'1", 210 pounds, shoulders squared in a way that made the air around him feel smaller. The leather vest with the iron veil patch, the tattoo creeping up the left side of his neck, a black compass rose with 1 point missing, the cardinal direction that led home, because home was a concept Ronan Voss had stopped believing in. "You grabbed my sleeve," Ronan said simply. "That's enough." He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. In the world Ronan inhabited, the world of men who had fought in places where the definition of enemy changed every hour, you didn't need a reason to protect someone. You needed a reason not to. He made 2 calls. The first to Jude. Pull 4 brothers, vehicles, we're moving. The second to Declan Marsh, the Iron Veil's president, a man whose voice sounded like gravel poured over broken glass, who answered every call on the first ring and asked questions only after the situation was handled. Detish got a kid at the rally. Says a man came to his house last night asking wrong questions. Man just rabbited from the crowd. Kid's mother isn't answering the phone. A pause. The kind of pause that contained an entire decision tree compressed into 2 seconds. Take who you need. Call me when you're on site. That was it. No debate, no committee, no liability assessment or risk-reward analysis or bureaucratic chain of approval. A child was possibly in danger, and the response was immediate. A single sentence that carried the full weight of an organization built by men who had learned the cost of hesitation. Within 6 minutes, Ronan had Eli in the passenger seat of Jude's truck. 2 more vehicles followed, a black pickup carrying Dex Moreno, who ran the club's intelligence network and could find a paper trail in a hurricane, and a gray SUV with Pike and Garrett, 2 former Army Rangers who communicated in looks and hand signals the way other people communicated in full sentences. Eli gave directions in a voice that grew quieter with every turn. The roads narrowed as they climbed away from town, 2 lanes to 1.5, pavement to gravel, civilization to the kind of rural isolation that was beautiful on postcards and terrifying when you were driving toward a house where someone should be answering the phone and wasn't. The Mercer property sat at the end of a dirt road that dead-ended against a wall of pine forest. A small frame house, white paint peeling, front porch sagging on the left side. A tire swing hung from an oak tree, turning slowly in the wind with the lazy, aimless motion of something abandoned. A blue Honda Civic sat in the driveway. If the mother had left, she hadn't driven. Ronan was out of the truck before it fully stopped. He held up a closed fist, military hand signal for halt, and Jude, Dex, Pike, and Garrett froze in their vehicles, engines idling, watching. He walked to the front door. The screen door was closed, but the inner door behind it stood open, roughly 3 inches. Not thrown wide, not visibly forced, just open. The way a door might look if someone had left in a hurry, or if someone had entered without bothering to close it behind them. He pushed the screen door. It swung on hinges that screamed in the cold air. He stepped inside. The house smelled like old coffee and pine cleaner and something else. Something faint, chemical, out of place. Like adhesive. Like the residue of tape recently removed from a surface. The living room was small, tidy, and wrong. Everything was in its approximate place, couch cushions, lamps, books on a shelf, but there was a quality to the arrangement that nagged at Ronan's trained eye. It was too orderly. Not the natural order of a lived-in home, but the reconstructed order of a space that had been taken apart and reassembled by hands that knew the original layout from photographs, but didn't know the small human imperfections. A magazine left open, a remote slightly off-center, a throw pillow crushed from someone sitting on it. This room had been searched by professionals. He moved through the kitchen. Same story. Drawers closed, but the contents inside were stacked too neatly, the way they look after someone wearing gloves has sorted through every item and replaced them in an order that approximated normalcy without achieving it. The hallway led to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The master bedroom was undisturbed, or at least it appeared that way, but a closet shelf had been shifted slightly to the left, and a faint rectangular outline on the shelf showed where something had sat for years, collecting dust around its edges, until it was recently removed. A metal box, something roughly the size of a lockbox. It was gone. Ronan returned to the front porch. Eli was already out of the truck, standing at the bottom of the steps with Jude's massive frame directly behind him, blocking the wind the way a cliff face blocks the sea. "Your mom isn't here, Eli." The boy's face didn't collapse. It hardened. A terrible, premature hardness, the look of a child who has been preparing for bad news so long that its arrival feels less like shock and more like confirmation. "There's a metal box," Ronan continued. "Your dad's. Kept in the bedroom closet?" "Yeah." Eli's voice was flat. "Mom said never to touch it. She said it was Dad's work stuff. Important. It's gone." Eli closed his eyes. When he opened them, there was something in his expression that looked nothing like a 13-year-old boy. It looked like a man who had just watched a theory become a fact. "He was looking for that," Eli whispered. "Yesterday. The man. He was looking for that." Jude shifted his weight behind the boy, and the movement was barely perceptible. A slight adjustment that put his body between Eli and the tree line, between Eli and whatever might be watching from the woods. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was instinct. The instinct of a man who had spent years protecting people in places where the threat could come from any direction, and who had carried that instinct home with him the way others carried suitcases. Ronan crouched until he was eye level with Eli. His knees cracked, his back protested. 41 years old, and his body kept a detailed ledger of every debt. Eli, I need you to tell me about your father. The boy's jaw tightened. What about him? Everything. Start with what he did. Eli looked at the ground, at his shoes, at the dirt under his shoes, at anything that wasn't the face of a man asking questions about the worst thing that had ever happened to him. He was a journalist, Eli said finally. Small time. Local papers, online stuff. He said he was working on something big before the accident. What kind of accident? Car went off the road. Black ice, they said. November 2 years ago. Same month as now. Eli paused, swallowed. Mom never believed it. She said Dad was too careful. She said he knew those roads better than anyone. Ronan stood. His mind was assembling pieces. The man at the rally, the searched house, the missing lockbox, the dead journalist, the 2-year gap. The picture forming wasn't complete, but its shape was already visible, the way you can see a building's blueprint in its foundation even before the walls go up. Dex, he said, pull everything on a man named Hale. Run something called the Hale Foundation. Philanthropy, veterans, charities, the clean stuff. Then pull everything underneath the clean stuff. Dex Moreno was already in the back of his truck with a laptop open, cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth, fingers moving across the keyboard with a speed that contradicted his laid-back demeanor. He had been Army intelligence before his discharge, the kind of analyst who could trace a money transfer through 6 countries and arrive at the original sender before finishing his coffee. Hale, he repeated. First name? Don't have it yet, but he was at the rally today. White male, mid-40s, expensive watch, gray polo, had a booth, had brochures, had the kind of smile that makes you check your wallet. Dex nodded once and disappeared into his screen. Ronan turned back to the house. He was standing in the doorway when his phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. 4 words. The boy saw nothing. He stared at the screen. The message had no sender ID, no metadata he could trace from a phone this basic. But the implication was clear. Someone knew Eli had talked. Someone knew Ronan was here. Someone was close enough to know these things in real time. And that someone was not asking a question. They were delivering an instruction. A warning dressed as a statement. Ronan turned the phone so Jude could read it. Jude's expression didn't change. Nothing about Jude's expression ever changed. It was the same look he'd worn when the IED took his leg. A flat, immovable focus, a refusal to allow the world's violence to register as surprise. They know, Jude said. They knew before we got here. Ronan looked at Eli. The boy was sitting on the porch steps now, his elbows on his knees, staring at the empty driveway where his mother's car sat without his mother in it. The tire swing turned in the wind behind him. The afternoon light was already failing, the mountains pulling shadows across the valley like a blanket being dragged over a grave. Someone had searched this house with surgical precision. Someone had taken the only physical evidence linking a dead journalist's investigation to a crime that had been running for years. Someone had sent an anonymous warning within minutes of Ronan's arrival. And somewhere out there, Eli's mother was missing. Ronan's phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. This time, just 2 words. Walk away. He read the message, deleted it, slid the phone back into his vest pocket. Then he looked at Jude, and what passed between them in that single glance held more weight than 100 conversations. A shared history of orders given and refused, of lines drawn and crossed, of men who had been told to walk away from things that mattered, and who had learned through blood and consequence that walking away was just another word for complicity. Call Deck, Ronan said quietly. Full chapter. Nobody goes home tonight. Jude pulled out his phone. Behind them, the wind picked up through the pines, and the empty house creaked in a way that sounded almost like a voice trying to tell them something it had been holding for 2 years. Eli didn't look up from the steps, but his hand, small, cold, trembling, reached out again and found the edge of Ronan's leather vest and held on. and Ronan let him. Because somewhere in the gap between a warning that said walk away and a boy whose mother had vanished, the decision had already been made. Not with words, not with logic, with something older, something that lived in the part of Ronan Voss that still believed protecting the vulnerable wasn't a choice. It was the only thing that separated the living from the merely alive. The sun dropped behind the western ridge. The shadows swallowed the valley whole, and in the pocket of a dead journalist's missing lockbox, the truth waited in the dark, patient, dangerous, and worth killing for. The Iron Vale Clubhouse sat 14 miles east of Ashridge, down a two-lane road that hadn't been repaved since the last administration forgot it existed. It was a converted auto repair garage, cinder block walls, corrugated metal roof, a parking lot of cracked asphalt where oil stains had become permanent geography. The neon sign out front still read Grady's transmission in letters that buzzed and flickered like a dying pulse, even though Grady had been dead for 6 years and the club had bought the building at auction for less than the cost of a decent used truck. Inside, the air tasted like burnt coffee, cigarette smoke that had soaked into every surface until the walls themselves seemed to exhale it, and the faint metallic edge of gun oil from the cleaning station Jude maintained in the back room with the religious precision of a man whose survival had once depended on a weapon functioning perfectly every single time. Ronan stood at the center table under a single overhead light that turned everything beneath it into a stage. Around him, 18 members of the Iron Veil sat or stood in various postures of exhaustion and attention. It was past midnight. The rally had ended 8 hours ago. Nobody had gone home. Declan Marsh had made the call. Full chapter, lockdown. And when Deck made a call, you showed up or you explained later why your absence mattered more than the reason you were summoned. Deck himself sat at the head of the table. 61 years old, former Navy, 3 combat deployments, 2 ex-wives, 1 surviving kidney. His hair was iron gray and cut close enough to the skull that it looked like metal filings pressed against stone. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a knife wound from a bar fight in Norfolk in 1994 that he'd never had properly stitched because the nearest hospital would have asked questions he didn't want to answer. He hadn't spoken since Ronan started talking. He listened the way heavy equipment idles, still on the surface, enormous power underneath, waiting for someone to engage the throttle. "So let me make sure I got this," Dex said when Ronan finished. His voice was the sound of a truck dragging chains over asphalt. "You picked up a kid at the rally, took him to his house. House was tossed by professionals. Mother's gone. Father's dead, 2 years cold, ruled an accident nobody believes was an accident. There's a missing lockbox full of evidence connecting a local philanthropist to financial fraud. And this philanthropist, Hale, has already sent you 2 anonymous messages telling you to walk away. That's the shape of it. And you want the club involved. The club is already involved. I brought 4 brothers to that house. Whoever's watching knows our patches. That ship sailed the moment we rolled up the driveway." Deck's jaw worked. He had a habit of grinding his teeth when he was processing, a sound like stones being polished in a tumbler. He looked around the table. 18 faces. Some of them showed concern. Some showed the flat readiness of men accustomed to situations that could turn violent. And some, Ronan noticed it immediately, showed something else. Doubt. Cutter Briggs was the first to speak. He sat 3 seats down from Deck, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed over a chest that strained the stitching of his vest. Cutter had been with the Iron Veil for 19 years. Longer than Ronan, longer than anyone except Deck. He was the club's treasurer, and the closest thing it had to a political operator, the man who maintained relationships with local businesses, negotiated lease agreements, and ensured the Iron Veil's presence in Ashridge remained tolerated by the people who would have preferred them gone. He had a round face and small eyes that calculated everything they touched. "I got a question," Cutter said. "Who is this kid to us?" The room shifted. Not physically, nobody moved, but the energy changed the way air pressure changes before a storm, an invisible drop that you feel in your sinuses before you see the clouds. "He's a kid," Ronan said. "He's a stranger's kid. We don't know him. We don't know his mother. We don't know his dead father. And you want to put this club sideways with a man who's got money, connections, and apparently enough reach to have your phone number before you even left the property." I'm not asking for a vote on whether the kid matters, Cutter. Maybe you should be. Because last time I checked, this club operates on consensus, not on one brother's gut feeling at a charity barbecue. The words hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. Ronan felt the heat climb the back of his neck, felt his hands tighten into shapes that weren't quite fists but weren't far from it. Cutter wasn't wrong about the process. The Iron Veil wasn't a dictatorship. Decisions that put the club at risk went to the table, went to a vote, went through the machinery of collective agreement that kept an organization of damaged men from devolving into chaos. That was the rule. But Ronan had never been good with rules that stood between him and a child who was afraid. "The kid grabbed my sleeve," Ronan said, and his voice dropped into a register that made two of the newer members look at the floor. "He was shaking so hard I could feel it through the leather. His mother is missing. His father is dead. And the man who came to his house is connected enough to make a journalist's car go off a mountain road on a dry night they called black ice. So you tell me, Cutter, what's our consensus on that?" Silence. Cutter didn't flinch. That was the thing about Cutter. He never flinched. He absorbed impact the way sandbags absorb bullets, taking the hit and holding position. His small eyes moved from Ronan to Deck and back. "I'm not saying we don't help. I'm saying we need to know what we're walking into. You're asking 18 men to put their lives, their families, and this club on the line based on a kid's word and an empty house. And 2 threatening texts from an unknown number," Jude added from the doorway, where he stood like a sentinel carved from the same cinder block as the walls. "Don't forget those." "Those prove someone doesn't want attention," Cutter countered. "They don't prove fraud. They don't prove murder. They don't prove anything except that we've made someone nervous. And making nervous people more nervous is how brothers end up in hospitals. Or worse." Deck raised a hand. Not high, just enough for the overhead light to catch the scarred knuckles, the weathered skin, the faded anchor tattoo on the webbing between his thumb and forefinger. The room went silent the way rooms go silent when the person who controls them decides it's time. "Dex," Dex said, "what do you have?" Dex Moreno was seated in the corner with his laptop balanced on a stack of old motor oil cases. He hadn't spoken during the entire briefing. He'd been working, fingers on keys, cigarette burning down to a filter he'd forgotten to replace, eyes locked on a screen that painted his face in cold blue light. "Victor Hale," Dex said, and the name landed on the table like a dropped blade. 46 years old, born in Richmond, raised in D.C. suburbs. MBA from Georgetown. Ran a private equity firm for 7 years before pivoting to nonprofit work. Founded the Hale Foundation 4 years ago. Mission statement: supporting veteran reintegration and rural community development. Annual revenue reported at $3.2 million. Donor base includes local businesses, county government grants, and several state-level political action committees. "Sounds clean," Cutter said. "Sounds clean because it's designed to sound clean." Dex pulled the cigarette from his mouth and crushed it in a coffee cup that had become an ashtray 3 hours ago. "But here's where it gets interesting. The Hale Foundation operates through 4 subsidiary organizations. Each one is registered in a different state. Each one has a different board of directors. And each one funnels money to a central holding company called Ridgeline Asset Group, which is registered in Delaware, because of course it is, and has no public-facing operations, no employees, no office address, and no tax filings after its first year of incorporation." The room absorbed this information the way soil absorbs rain after a drought, slowly, deeply, with a kind of reluctant recognition that the ground had been dry for too long. Eli's father, Dex continued, was Thomas Mercer, freelance investigative journalist, published in regional papers, mostly economic stories, county government spending, that kind of thing. Small readership, no national profile. But his last piece, published 4 months before he died, was a feature on inconsistencies in charitable spending in rural Virginia. He named 3 organizations. 2 of them are Hale Foundation subsidiaries. Ronan felt the pieces clicking into place, not with satisfaction, but with the grim recognition of a pattern he'd seen before. The powerful man with the clean public face, the small-time journalist who got too close, the accident that wasn't, the evidence that disappeared. It was a blueprint as old as corruption itself, and it worked because the people it targeted were always small enough to ignore, and the people behind it were always large enough to survive scrutiny. "There's more," Dex said, and the way he said it, quiet, careful, the tone of a man delivering information he wished he didn't have, made everyone in the room lean forward by a fraction of an inch. Thomas Mercer's death was investigated by the Ashridge County Sheriff's Office. Lead investigator was Deputy Glenn Foley. The investigation lasted 11 days. Conclusion: single vehicle accident, adverse weather conditions, no evidence of foul play. Case closed. 11 days, Jude said from the doorway. That's fast. It's fast if you're trying to solve something. It's exactly right if you're trying to bury it. Dex paused. Deputy Foley retired from the sheriff's office 6 months after closing the case. 3 months after that, he purchased a house in Staunton. 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, half-acre lot, cash purchase. $260,000. The silence that followed wasn't the kind that precedes a response. It was the kind that follows a detonation, the stunned, ringing aftermath of something that has changed the shape of the room. A deputy, Cutter said slowly, on a county salary, bought a $250,000 house in cash. 3 months after ruling a journalist's death an accident, Dex confirmed. 3 months after closing the case that would have exposed a multi-million-dollar fraud. Ronan looked at Dex. The old man's expression hadn't changed, but something behind his eyes had shifted. A geological movement, tectonic, the kind of thing that precedes earthquakes. Dex had spent 40 years watching systems fail the people they were supposed to protect. The military had failed him. The VA had failed him. The legal system had failed him. He had built the Iron Veil not as an alternative to those systems, but as an acknowledgement that they were broken beyond repair, that the only protection worth trusting was the kind that came from men who had nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. "Where's the boy now?" Dex asked. "Back room," Ronan said. "Pike's with him." "He's been fed?" "Jude got him food 2 hours ago. He ate half a sandwich and fell asleep on the couch." Dex nodded, a slow, deliberate nod, the kind that wasn't agreement but acceptance. The acceptance of a man who recognized that the situation had already made the decision for him, and the only question left was whether he would face it or turn his back. "We find the mother," Dex said. "We secure the boy, and we find out exactly what Thomas Mercer knew that was worth killing him over." "Dex," Cutter started. "I heard you, Cutter. Every word. And you're right. This is risky, and we don't know the full picture, and this could blow back on the club in ways we can't predict. But I didn't build this table so we could sit around it and decide which kids deserve protection based on a cost-benefit analysis. That's what the system does. That's why the system fails. And that's why we exist." Cutter held Dex's gaze for a long moment. Something passed between them. Years of friendship, years of disagreement, the accumulated weight of shared history pressing against the sharp edge of the present. Then Cutter uncrossed his arms and placed both palms flat on the table. "Then we do it smart," Cutter said. "Not loud, not fast. Smart. Because if Hale has a deputy in his pocket, he's got other people too, and we don't know who." Dex looked at Ronan. "Agreed?" Ronan nodded once. He didn't trust himself to speak. The tension between what he wanted to do, which was find Victor Hale and put him in a room with no windows and ask questions until the answers stopped being lies, and what needed to be done, which was methodical, patient, and surgical, pulled at him like opposing tides. He felt Danny's dog tags against his chest, cold metal on warm skin, and he thought about the last phone call his brother had made before the convoy, the one where Danny had said, "We found something out here, Ro. Something bad. Command doesn't want to hear it." 2 weeks later, Danny was dead. Official report. Enemy combatant engagement. Ronan had read the report 17 times. He'd never believed it, not once. And now he was standing in a room full of men he trusted with his life, looking at another cover-up built on another dead man's silenced truth, and the rage inside him was so cold and so deep that it felt less like anger and more like geography, a permanent feature of his internal landscape that would never erode. He stepped into the back room. Eli was curled on the old leather couch, knees pulled to his chest, Pike's jacket draped over him like a blanket. Pike sat in a folding chair 2 feet away, hands resting on his knees, watching the boy sleep with the patient stillness of a man who had stood guard over things more precious than sleep. He looked up when Ronan entered and communicated everything he needed to say with a single slow blink. The kid's okay, he's exhausted. Don't wake him unless you have to. Ronan didn't wake him. He stood in the doorway and watched the rise and fall of the boy's breathing. Shallow, uneven, the breathing of someone whose body was resting, but whose nervous system hadn't received the memo. Even in sleep, Eli's hands were clenched. Even in sleep, his brow was furrowed, carrying the weight of a question no 13-year-old should have to ask. Where is my mother, and is she still alive? Ronan's phone buzzed in his pocket. He stepped back into the hallway, away from the boy, away from Pike, into the narrow corridor between the main room and the storage area where the overhead light didn't reach, and the only illumination came from the red glow of an exit sign that hadn't worked in years. The text was from the same unknown number. You were warned. Now the mother pays for your decision. Ronan's hand closed around the phone so hard the case cracked along one edge. He stood in the red half-light, perfectly still, breathing through his nose in the slow, measured rhythm of a man containing an explosion. The walls of the corridor seemed to narrow. The exit sign hummed its dead frequency. Somewhere outside, a Harley engine turned over, someone arriving late for the lockdown, and the sound vibrated through the cinder block into the soles of his boots and up into his jaw. They had Eli's mother. That was no longer speculation. That was a statement of fact delivered by someone confident enough to announce it. He walked back into the main room, every head turned. They have the mother, Ronan said. He held up the phone. Deck took it, read the message, and passed it down the table. Each man read it with the same expression, the flat, controlled processing of information that demanded action and offered no clear target. Trace the number, Deck said to Dex. Already tried. It's a burner. Routed through a VoIP service that dead ends at a server farm in Northern Virginia. Whoever's sending these knows what they're doing. Or they're paying someone who does, Cutter said. Same difference. The room fell into the kind of silence that isn't absence but presence, the physical weight of men thinking the same thought without saying it. They were in. All the way in. The warnings, the threats, the missing mother, the dead journalist, the bought deputy, the constellation of facts had arranged itself into a shape that left no room for retreat. This wasn't a favor anymore. This wasn't a side project or a good deed or a charitable impulse. This was the thing the Iron Veil had been built for, even if they hadn't known it until tonight. I want to know everything about Hale's operation by morning, Dex said. Dex, follow the money. Every subsidiary, every board member, every wire transfer. Cutter, reach out to your contacts at the county level, quietly. Find out who else Hale owns. Jude set a security rotation on this building. Nobody in or out without a patch. Pike and Garrett, you're on the kid. He paused, looked at Ronan. And Ronan. Yeah, I know what you're feeling right now. I've felt it, more than once. But if you go after Hale with what's inside you tonight, you'll make a mistake. And mistakes in this situation don't land on you. They land on that boy in the back room. Ronan didn't answer. He couldn't, because Deck was right, and the truth of it sat on his chest like a stone. Get some sleep, Deck said. That's an order. Ronan didn't sleep. He sat on the concrete step outside the back door of the clubhouse, in the dark, with the cold pressing against his face like a hand made of ice. The mountains were invisible, just black shapes cutting holes in a sky that had no stars. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and his breath came out in clouds that dissolved before they cleared his chin. He lit a cigarette. The flame from the lighter briefly illuminated the compass rose tattoo on his neck, the one with the missing cardinal point. North. The direction home. He'd had it done after Danny's funeral by a tattooist in Norfolk who didn't ask questions and didn't make small talk. The missing point was intentional. It meant that the way home had been removed, that the concept of home had been subtracted from his map, and what remained was direction without destination. Movement for its own sake, the eternal forward push of a man who couldn't stop because stopping meant feeling, and feeling meant drowning. Danny had been 23. He'd had plans, college after service, maybe teaching. He talked about coaching Little League in whatever small town he ended up in, about Sunday cookouts and a dog and a front porch where he could watch the sunset. Normal things. Human things. The things that people who haven't been broken still believe are possible. Ronan had stopped believing in those things, but he hadn't stopped protecting them. That was the contradiction at the center of his existence. A man who guarded a world he no longer belonged to, who fought for a peace he could never feel, who kept other people's lights on while his own had gone dark. The back door opened. Footsteps on concrete. The heavy, slightly asymmetric gait of a man with one real leg. Jude sat down beside him without a word. He produced a thermos from somewhere inside his jacket, military grade, dented, still warm, and poured coffee into the cap. He offered it to Ronan. Ronan took it. The coffee was black and bitter and tasted like it had been brewed by someone who understood that flavor was secondary to function. They sat in silence for a long time. The kind of silence that only exists between people who have survived things together that cannot be communicated to anyone who wasn't there. The kind of silence that is, itself, a form of communication, a shared frequency below the threshold of language. "You're thinking about Danny," Jude said eventually. "I'm always thinking about Danny." "I know." Another silence, longer, deeper. "The kid reminds you of him." Ronan didn't answer. He didn't need to. Jude had said the thing that Ronan couldn't say, the thing that had been growing in his chest since the moment Eli grabbed his sleeve at the rally. It wasn't that Eli looked like Danny. He didn't. It wasn't even the age, or the vulnerability, or the fear. It was something less tangible and more devastating, a quality of openness, of desperate trust, of reaching toward a stranger because the familiar world had already proven itself dangerous. Danny had been like that. Danny had trusted people. Danny had believed that if you asked for help, someone would answer. Danny had been wrong, but Eli didn't have to be. "I'm not going to lose this one, Jude." The words came out before Ronan could stop them. They were raw, unfiltered, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with the boy and everything to do with a flag-draped coffin and a 23-year-old's dog tags that now hung against Ronan's sternum like a second heartbeat. Jude looked at him. In the darkness, his face was a map of damage, the lines, the scars, the perpetual tension in his jaw from pain that his prosthetic never fully managed. But his eyes were steady. Always steady. The eyes of a man who had learned that the world would take everything it could, and the only thing left was to decide what you refused to surrender. "Then we don't lose him," Jude said. He said it the way he said everything, simply, completely, as if the complexity of the world could be reduced to a single clear decision and the willingness to follow it into whatever darkness waited. Morning came gray and without warmth. The sky looked like wet cement, featureless, heavy, pressing down on the mountains as if trying to flatten them. Frost had coated every surface during the night, turning the parking lot into a sheet of dull glass, and the bikes parked along the building into rows of frozen sculptures. Ronan was standing at the main table with a cup of coffee he'd been holding for 20 minutes without drinking when Dex emerged from his corner with the expression of a man who has found something he wishes he hadn't. "Ronan, Deck, you're going to want to see this." The laptop screen showed a spreadsheet, rows and columns of transactions, dates, amounts, account numbers. To most people, it would have looked like noise. To Dex, it was a story written in numbers. The Hale Foundation received a total of $4.7 million in donations over the past 3 years, Dex said. Of that, approximately $1.9 million was distributed to actual programs, veteran housing, job training, community grants. Real programs with real recipients, enough to pass an audit, enough to maintain the appearance of legitimacy. "And the other $2.8 million?" Deck asked. "Routed through shell organizations to Ridgeline Asset Group, which then distributed funds to a series of private accounts. Some domestic, some offshore. The domestic accounts are held by individuals with no obvious connection to Hale, but every single one of them has a public role. County officials, state inspectors, a health department administrator, a school board member." Dex paused. His cigarette had gone out, but he didn't notice. "And one retired deputy sheriff named Glenn Foley. He was buying the entire infrastructure," Ronan said. "Not just covering the fraud, building a network of people who owe him, people who'll look the other way when he needs them to." "It's a protection racket disguised as philanthropy," Dex confirmed. "And Thomas Mercer figured it out. He was following the money, the same trail I just followed, but he was doing it from the inside. He attended Hale Foundation events. He interviewed recipients. He requested public financial disclosures, and based on the timeline of his published articles, he was roughly 3 months away from having enough to go public when his car went off that road. The room felt smaller. The overhead light felt hotter. The coffee in Ronan's hand had gone cold, and he set it down on the table with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Eli said his mother didn't believe the accident, Ronan said. She was right. She wasn't just right, Dex said. She was a threat. If Thomas kept his evidence at home, in that lockbox, she had access to it. Hale spent 2 years watching, waiting, probably hoping the widow would grieve and move on and never open the box. But something changed. Something made him accelerate. The rally, Jude said from the doorway. Hale had a booth at the rally. He's been operating in this community for years. Then Eli, the dead journalist's son, recognizes his face and talks to a biker wearing a club patch. That's not just a loose end. That's the loose end connecting the one person who can identify him to an organization that can't be silenced with a cash payment. He panicked, Dex said. He moved, Ronan corrected. There's a difference. Panic is sloppy. This was planned. The house search was professional. The mother's disappearance was coordinated. The threatening texts were deliberate. This man doesn't panic, he executes. Dex sat back in his chair. The wood creaked under his weight. He folded his hands on the table. Scarred knuckles, thick fingers. The hands of a man who had built things and broken things in roughly equal measure. Then we have to be better than his plan, Dex said. Because right now he has the evidence. He has the mother. He has a network of bought officials who will block any investigation we try to trigger. And we have an exhausted kid sleeping on a couch and a collection of old soldiers who haven't slept in 20 hours. We have something else, Ronan said. What's that? He doesn't know what we know. He thinks the lockbox was the only copy. He thinks Thomas Mercer's evidence died with Thomas Mercer. He thinks this ends when the box is destroyed and the witnesses are silenced. Ronan paused, looked at the faces around the table, Jude, Dex, Pike, Garrett, Cutter, Deck, and the others. 18 men who had been trained by war and shaped by loss and held together by a bond that had no name more precise than brotherhood. But Thomas Mercer was a journalist, Ronan said. He spent his life chasing stories that powerful people didn't want told. A man like that doesn't put all his evidence in one box. He hides copies. He makes backups. He buries insurance in places only the people he trusts would know to look. You don't know that, Cutter said. No, but Eli might. Every eye in the room shifted toward the back room where a 13-year-old boy slept under a borrowed jacket, holding in his memory things his dead father may have told him, things that might be the only remaining thread connecting a buried truth to the surface of the world. Before anyone could speak, the front door of the clubhouse opened. Cold air flooded in. A figure stood in the doorway. A woman, early 40s, wearing a deputy sheriff's uniform. Her name tag read Harlan. She was thin, sharp-featured, with hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch the skin of her temples. Her hand rested on her holster, not gripping it, but touching it, the way a nervous person touches a talisman. Deputy Harlan, Dex said. His voice didn't change. His posture didn't change. But the room around him changed. Every man shifting slightly, weight redistributing, attention concentrating on the doorway with the focused precision of an audience watching a fuse burn. Mr. Marsh. She didn't step inside. I've received a report that a minor child, Eli Mercer, was seen leaving the Freedom Ride rally yesterday in the company of several members of your organization. His mother has filed a report expressing concern for his safety. The lie was so clean, so professionally delivered, that it almost sounded true. His mother had filed a report. His mother, who was missing. His mother, who was being held by the same people this deputy was now serving, knowingly or unknowingly, by standing in this doorway demanding the return of the only witness who could bring them down. Ronan stepped forward. His mother is missing, deputy. She's not answering her phone. Her house was searched. If someone filed a report using her name, I'd suggest you verify who actually made that call. Deputy Harlan's eyes flicked to Ronan, assessed him. The leather vest, the scars, the tattoo, the posture of a man who stood like he was daring gravity to try harder. I'm not here to debate, Mr. Voss? Mr. Voss? I'm here to ensure the safety of a minor. If Eli Mercer is in this building, I need to see him. Now! Deck stood. The chair scraped against concrete, and the sound was a period at the end of a sentence. You're welcome to verify the boy is safe, Deputy, but you're not taking him anywhere until we know who filed that report and whether his mother is actually the one who made it. Because if she didn't, if someone used her name to manufacture a custody complaint, then removing this child from our protection would be placing him directly in the hands of the people who made his mother disappear. Harlan's hand pressed harder against her holster. Not a threat. Something worse. Uncertainty. The look of a woman who had come here following orders she hadn't questioned and was now standing at the threshold of a room full of men who were asking her to question everything. I have jurisdiction, she said. But her voice had lost a fraction of its authority, and everyone in that room heard it. You have a badge, Deck replied. Those aren't always the same thing. The standoff held for 10 seconds that felt like 10 minutes. The wind pushed against the open door. The neon sign outside buzzed its dead man's name into the cold. And somewhere in the back room, a 13-year-old boy slept through the moment that his fate was being negotiated by strangers, some trying to protect him, some trying to deliver him to the people who wanted him silent, and one woman in a uniform standing in the space between, deciding which side of the line she occupied. Deputy Harlan took one step back, then another. I'll verify the report, she said, but I'll be back. And next time, I won't be alone. She turned and walked to her cruiser. The door closed. The engine started. The headlights swept across the parking lot like searchlights scanning a prison yard. And then she was gone, taillights shrinking down the dark road until they disappeared behind the tree line. Ronan exhaled. His breath formed a cloud in the freezing air pouring through the still open doorway. She'll be back, Cutter said. With more deputies, Jude added. And a court order, Deck said. If Hale's network includes a judge, and at this point I'd bet my left arm it does, they'll have a custody order by noon, legal, signed, enforceable, and will have no grounds to refuse. Deck looked at Ronan. The look carried the weight of every decision they'd ever made together and every consequence they'd ever shared. How long do we have? Deck asked. Hours, Deck said. Maybe less. Deck nodded, slow, final, the nod of a man accepting a timeline that had just been cut in half. Then we don't wait for them to come back. We find the evidence Thomas Mercer hid. We find the mother. And we do it before anyone with a badge and a bought signature shows up to take that boy out of the only safe place he has left. He looked around the table. 18 faces, some afraid, some resolved, all present. This is the line, Deck said. Once we cross it, we don't come back. If anyone wants out, this is the moment. No judgment, no consequences. Walk out that door and go home. Nobody moved. Not a single man. The door was still open. The cold wind poured in, carrying the smell of frozen pine and distant exhaust, and the faint metallic promise of a storm that hadn't arrived yet but was coming, coming fast, coming hard, coming for all of them. Deck reached over and pulled the door shut. The latch engaged with a sound like a round being chambered. And just like that, 18 men and one sleeping boy crossed a line that didn't exist on any map, the invisible boundary between caution and commitment, between watching and acting, between the world that told them to walk away and the world they were about to walk into with no guarantee they would come back the same. The clock on the wall read 3:47 a.m. By sunrise, everything would change. Dawn didn't arrive in Ashridge that morning. It seeped, a slow gray hemorrhage of light that bled through the cloud cover without warmth or clarity, turning the mountains into smudged charcoal shapes and the parking lot of the Ironvale Clubhouse into a flat expanse of frost that cracked like eggshell under every boot that crossed it. Ronan hadn't slept. He stood at the main table with a topographic map of the county spread over the surface, waited at the corners with coffee mugs and a .45 caliber round that Jude used as a paperweight. Red circles marked locations: Thomas Mercer's house, the rally grounds, the Hale Foundation's registered office in downtown Ashridge, the 3 addresses associated with Shell subsidiaries Dex had identified overnight. The map looked like a crime scene diagram, which Ronan supposed it was. Eli sat across from him. The boy had woken 20 minutes ago, disoriented, frightened, and then, when he remembered where he was and why, settled into a stillness that was worse than panic, It was the stillness of acceptance. A child who had processed the possibility that his mother might not come back and had decided to function anyway because the alternative was collapse, and collapse was a luxury he couldn't afford. Eli. Ronan kept his voice level, neutral. The voice of a man reporting weather conditions. I need to ask you some questions about your dad. Things he might have said. Things that didn't make sense at the time but might make sense now. The boy's hands were wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate that Pike had made using a packet from a box that had been sitting in the clubhouse kitchen since nobody could remember when. The chocolate was probably stale. Eli hadn't complained. What kind of things? Did your dad ever talk about hiding something? Copies of his work? Backup files? Anything he kept separate from the lockbox? Eli's eyes dropped to the mug. The surface of the chocolate reflected the overhead light in a small, trembling circle. He used to say stuff when I was younger, like riddles almost. Mom said it was just his way of talking, but sometimes I thought he was trying to tell me something without actually telling me. What kind of stuff? He said. Eli stopped. His jaw worked. The tendons in his neck stood out, thin and sharp, a child's anatomy carrying a man's tension. He said, if anything ever happens to me, the truth isn't in the box. It's where I taught you to fish. The room went quiet. Not the absence of sound. The clubhouse was never truly quiet, with its ticking pipes and humming lights, and the constant low groan of the building settling against itself. But the absence of human sound, the held breath of every man who heard those words and understood immediately what they meant. Thomas Mercer had made a copy. He had hidden it somewhere only his son would know. Where did he teach you to fish? Ronan asked. There's a cabin, out past Briar Falls on the Elk River. It's abandoned, been empty for years. Dad used to take me there on weekends. We'd fish off the dock. He said it was the only place in the world where nobody could find him. Eli paused. He said that a lot, actually. The only place nobody could find him. I thought he just liked the quiet. Ronan looked at Dex. Dex was already typing, searching county property records, satellite imagery, anything that could confirm the location. Briar Falls, Dex muttered. Elk River access. There's a cluster of decommissioned fishing cabins about 9 miles upstream from the Route 7 bridge. Most of them are on state land, abandoned after the county pulled recreational permits in 2019. No utilities, no road maintenance. You'd need 4-wheel drive or a bike to get back there. Or you'd need to want to disappear, Jude said from his position near the door. Where he'd been standing for so long, he seemed to have become part of the architecture. Ronan folded the map. The decision was already made. He could feel it in the room, the collective lean forward, the molecular shift in attention that happens when a group of trained men identifies an objective. But before he could speak, the sound of tires on frozen gravel cut through the morning air, followed by the slam of a car door and boots on concrete. The front door opened without a knock. Cutter walked in. He'd left 2 hours ago, the only man who'd left since the lockdown, claiming he needed to check on his wife, who had a medical condition that required monitoring. Nobody had questioned it. Cutter was the longest tenured member aside from Deck. His word carried weight, and his reasons were his own. But something was wrong. Ronan saw it before anyone else. It was in Cutter's walk, too precise, too controlled, the careful locomotion of a man managing something inside himself that threatened to spill. His face was composed, but the muscles around his eyes were tight, pulled inward, the involuntary contraction that happens when someone is holding information that burns. Morning, Cutter said. He didn't look at Ronan, didn't look at Eli, looked only at Deck. How's Karen? Deck asked. Fine. Sleeping. Cutter moved to the coffee station, a folding table with a Mr. Coffee machine that had been running continuously for 16 hours, and poured himself a cup with the deliberate movements of a man buying time before saying something he couldn't take back. Ronan watched him, the way a sniper watches a doorway. Patient, focused, cataloging micro-movements, the slight tremor in Cutter's pouring hand, the way he positioned his body so his back was to the table, the 2-second pause before he turned around. Details. The kind of details that saved lives or revealed lies, depending on which side of them you stood. We found something, Ronan said, testing. Thomas Mercer hid copies of his evidence. Eli knows where. Cutter's reaction was invisible to everyone in the room except Ronan. A contraction, a micro-flinch around the left eye, the involuntary response of a man hearing information he already possessed. Not surprise, recognition, the way you recognize a word you've already read, a fact you've already filed, a piece of a puzzle you've already seen from a different angle. Ronan's stomach dropped. It was the same feeling he'd had in Helmand Province, the moment before the third vehicle in the convoy hit the buried charge. The instant when the world was still intact but his body already knew it wasn't, the fraction of a second where knowledge exists in the nervous system before the mind is willing to process it. Good, Cutter said. He sipped his coffee. When do we move? Within the hour, Deck answered. Cutter nodded, set down his cup, walked to the far end of the table and sat in his usual chair, crossing his arms in his usual posture, settling into his usual silence. Everything about him was usual, practiced, performed, and Ronan couldn't breathe. He stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wall, 26 degrees, frost still heavy on every surface, the sky pressing down like a ceiling that was slowly lowering. He walked to the far corner of the parking lot, out of sight from the windows, and stood behind the dumpster where the smell of old oil and wet cardboard was thick enough to taste. He pulled out his phone. His hands were steady. His mind was not. He called Dex. Don't react. Don't turn around. Don't change your expression. I need you to pull Cutter's phone records for the last 48 hours. Personal phone, not the club line. A pause. 2 seconds. 3. Understood, Dex said, and hung up. Ronan stood behind the dumpster for another 90 seconds, counting his breaths the way his VA therapist had taught him. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. It was supposed to calm the nervous system. It had never once worked. But the counting gave his mind something to hold on to while the rest of him dealt with the possibility, the growing, sickening probability, that the man who had questioned his judgment last night, the man who had argued against helping Eli, the man who had left the clubhouse at 4 a.m. and returned with information already in his eyes, that man might be the leak. 20 minutes later, Dex found him. The intelligence officer appeared at the corner of the building like smoke taking human form, quiet, angled, his face carrying the particular blankness that Ronan had learned to read as the most dangerous expression in Dex's limited repertoire. Tell me, Ronan said. Dex lit a cigarette, took a drag, let the smoke leak from his nostrils in twin streams that the cold air froze into white columns. Cutter's personal phone made 3 outgoing calls between 4:15 and 5:40 this morning. First call, his wife. Duration, 47 seconds. Second call, a landline registered to a property management company in Staunton. Staunton, where the retired deputy bought his house. Same city, different address, but the property management company, Ridgeline Properties, shares a name root with Ridgeline Asset Group, Hales Holding Company. The air seemed to solidify around Ronan's body. He felt it pressing against his skin, not cold anymore, but dense, heavy. The atmosphere of a room where the oxygen was being slowly replaced by something unbreathable. The third call? Ronan asked. Burner number. No registration. Duration, 6 minutes and 12 seconds. Same burner that's been texting me? Different number, but routed through the same VoIP service. Same server farm in Northern Virginia. Ronan closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, the world was red. Not the red of anger, but the red of the exit sign in the hallway, the dead glow of a way out that led nowhere. Cutter Briggs. 19 years in the Iron Veil. Deck's oldest remaining brother. The man who handled the club's finances, who knew every account, every asset, every vulnerability. The man who sat at the table and argued process and consensus while his personal phone connected to the same network that was sending Ronan death threats. How long? Ronan asked. The question wasn't specific, but Dex understood it. I went back 6 months. Cutter's phone shows regular contact with numbers associated with Ridgeline Properties going back at least that far. Weekly calls, sometimes more. Always from his personal line, never from the club phone. 6 months. At minimum. The records I can access only go back that far. It could be longer. Probably is. Ronan opened his eyes. The parking lot looked the same. Frost, asphalt, bikes, the dead neon sign. But it had changed. Everything had changed. The building behind him, the men inside it, the brotherhood he had trusted with his life for 11 years, all of it now had a crack running through its foundation, a fracture that extended down into the bedrock of everything the Iron Veil was supposed to be. Cutter wasn't just leaking information. He was connected to Hale's financial network, which meant one of two things. Either Cutter was being paid, or Cutter was being leveraged. Money or fear, greed or survival. The two currencies that bought silence in every corrupt system Ronan had ever encountered. Does Deck know? I came to you first. Deck needs to know. I know. That's why I came to you first. Because when you tell him, it's going to break something inside that man that I'm not sure can be fixed. And you're the only person at this table he'll hear it from without putting his fist through a wall. Ronan looked at Dex. The intelligence officer's face was still blank, but his cigarette hand had a tremor that hadn't been there before, the only visible evidence that the man behind the analytical mask was feeling something that analysis couldn't contain. Watch the boy, Ronan said. Don't let Cutter near him. Don't let anyone near him except Pike and Jude. He walked back inside. Deck was in the small office behind the main room, a closet-sized space with a metal desk, a filing cabinet, and a window that looked out onto nothing but the side of the neighboring building's cinder block wall. He was sitting with his hands folded on the desk, staring at the wall with the concentration of a man reading text that wasn't there. Ronan closed the door behind him. The latch clicked. Deck looked up. Something in Ronan's face told him everything before the first word was spoken. Deck's hands unfolded. His fingers spread flat on the desk surface. His jaw tightened until the scar from ear to mouth turned white. Who? Deck asked. Cutter? The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples were invisible but total, spreading outward through the small room, through the walls, through the foundation of the building, through the 19 years of shared history and accumulated trust that now had a hole in it, the exact size and shape of one man's betrayal. Deck didn't speak for a long time. His hands stayed flat on the desk. His breathing was audible, slow, deliberate, the controlled respiration of a man managing a cardiac event through sheer force of will. Evidence, he said finally. Ronan told him. The phone records, the calls to Ridgeline Properties, the connection to the VoIP service. The timing, Cutter leaving the clubhouse at 4 a.m., making contact with Hale's network, and returning with information already in his eyes. Deck listened. His expression didn't change. His posture didn't change. But something behind his face shifted, a structural failure, a load-bearing wall giving way in a building that appeared intact from the outside but was collapsing internally. 19 years, Deck said. Not to Ronan, to the wall, to the cinder block that had no answers and no loyalty and no capacity for betrayal because it was just stone, just dead material, incapable of the one thing that humans did better than anything else in creation. I know. I brought him in, after his discharge. He was living in a motel outside Roanoke, drinking himself into the floor. I drove 4 hours to pick him up. I put him in the spare room of my house. I fed him. I got him to meetings. I gave him a seat at this table. Deck's voice cracked, a hairline fracture in the granite that ran so deep it reached the mantel. I gave him a seat at this table. Ronan didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The betrayal of a brother wasn't a problem to be solved or an argument to be won. It was a wound, a specific surgical wound inflicted with the precision of someone who knew exactly where the arteries were because they had been trusted enough to learn the anatomy. We can't confront him yet, Ronan said, and the words tasted like metal in his mouth. If we confront him, he'll alert Hale. Hale will destroy whatever evidence Thomas Mercer hid at that cabin. And the mother, if she's still alive, becomes a liability they can't afford to keep. Deck's hands curled into fists on the desk. The knuckles went white. The old tattoo between his thumb and forefinger, the anchor, stretched and distorted. You're asking me to sit across the table from a man who sold this club to the people we're trying to bring down, and say nothing. I'm asking you to protect a 13-year-old boy and his missing mother by not tipping off the only man who can warn the enemy that we're coming. Dex stared at Ronan for 5 full seconds. Each second was a year. Each year was a war. How do we move without him knowing? We split the operation. Cutter stays here. Give him a task, something that keeps him at the clubhouse and away from the field. Tell him you need him to prepare for when Harlan comes back with a court order. Legal defense, documentation, whatever sounds convincing. Meanwhile, I take Jude, Pike, and Garrett to the cabin. Dex stays to monitor Cutter's communications in real time. If Cutter makes a call, we'll know immediately and we adjust. Deck uncurled his fists, one finger at a time, slowly, the way a man diffuses something explosive by working each wire individually. If you're wrong about the cabin, then we've lost time, but we haven't lost position. Cutter still doesn't know we're onto him, and the boy is still protected. And if you're right about the cabin, then we have the evidence, and Hale's network, including Cutter, becomes the hunted instead of the hunters. Dex stood. His chair scraped against the concrete floor, and the sound was a scream compressed into 3 inches of friction. He straightened to his full height, 6 feet even, but his presence occupied more space than measurement could account for, and looked at Ronan with eyes that had aged 10 years in the last 5 minutes. "Go," he said. "Take who you need. Find what Mercer hid. And Ronan, yeah, bring that boy's mother home." Ronan stepped out of the office and moved through the clubhouse with the controlled urgency of a man who knows that every second counts, but that running draws attention. He found Jude at the back door, Pike in the hallway, Garrett by the bikes. Each man received the same instruction delivered in the same low tone. A sentence or two, coordinates and purpose. The compressed briefing of operators who didn't need context to understand urgency. He stopped at the back room. Eli was sitting on the couch, awake now, holding the cold mug of hot chocolate like a talisman. The boy looked up when Ronan entered, and his eyes asked the question his mouth wouldn't form. "Your dad's cabin," Ronan said. "I need you to take us there." "Why?" "Because whatever he hid it for you, and you're the only person who knows where to look." Eli stood. He was shaking again, that fine, involuntary tremor that lived in his hands and traveled up his arms. But his chin was set, his jaw was locked, and the expression on his face was something Ronan recognized from battlefields and hospital wards and the funerals of men who died too young. It was the face of someone who had decided to function despite every signal in their body telling them to shut down. "Okay," Eli said. They moved. 2 trucks, 4 men, 1 boy. Ronan drove the lead vehicle with Eli in the passenger seat. Jude rode shotgun in the second truck with Pike and Garrett. The convoy, if you could call 2 vehicles a convoy, pulled out of the parking lot at 6:47 a.m., turning onto the county road that led north toward the river valley. In the rear-view mirror, Ronan saw the clubhouse shrink against the gray sky. He saw the dead neon sign. He saw the frosted bikes lined up along the wall. And standing at the window, barely visible through the glare of the morning light on dirty glass, he saw Cutter Briggs watching them leave. Their eyes didn't meet. The distance was too great and the glass too smeared. But Ronan felt it. The weight of being watched by someone who had once been trusted and was now something else entirely. Something that had no name in the vocabulary of the Brotherhood because the vocabulary of the Brotherhood did not contain words for what Cutter had become. He turned his eyes back to the road. The route north followed the Elk River as it carved through a valley that narrowed with every mile. The trees closed in, bare hardwoods giving way to dense pine that blocked the weak morning light and turned the road into a tunnel of gray-green shadow. The temperature dropped as they climbed. Frost became ice. The pavement ended 3 miles past the last mailbox, and the gravel that replaced it was rutted and frozen into ridges that punished the truck's suspension. Eli didn't speak. He sat with his hands between his knees, staring through the windshield at the road ahead with an intensity that bordered on trance. Occasionally his lips moved, forming words without sound, repeating directions to himself, navigating by memory through a landscape he hadn't visited since his father was alive. "Turn here," he said suddenly. "The fire road. On the left." Ronan saw it. Barely. A gap in the tree line that a person could mistake for a shadow if they weren't looking. No sign, no marker. Just 2 tire tracks pressed into frozen mud, leading into the forest at an angle that felt like descending into something the world had forgotten on purpose. The trucks crept forward. Branches scraped against the roof and doors, and the sound was like fingernails on metal, sharp, insistent, alive. The fire road dropped steeply for a quarter-mile, then leveled out at a clearing where the river appeared through the trees, its surface black and still and reflecting nothing. The cabin stood at the edge of the clearing. Small, maybe 400 square feet, log construction, roof partially collapsed on the eastern side, windows boarded from the inside. The front porch had surrendered to gravity years ago, sagging into the mud at an angle that made it look like the building was kneeling. A dock extended from the bank into the river. Wooden planks, several missing, the remaining ones gray and warped from years of weather and neglect. Eli stared at the cabin. His face was empty, not calm, but evacuated, as if every emotion he possessed had been pulled out to make room for the act of being here, in this place where his father had once been alive and was now permanently absent. "The dock," Eli said quietly. He used to say the fish liked the deep part, under the boards. He'd lie on the dock and reach down into the water. He said you had to be willing to get cold if you wanted to find what was hiding. Ronan looked at the dock, at the black water beneath it, at the frozen mud along the bank where boot prints from years ago had been fossilized by seasons of ice and rain. "Stay in the truck," he told Eli. "No." The word was small but absolute, a refusal that carried more authority than anything a 13-year-old should have been capable of producing. "Eli, he was my dad. He hid this for me. I'm going." Ronan looked at the boy, saw the trembling, saw the locked jaw, saw the eyes that held the particular combination of terror and determination that he had only ever seen in people who had nothing left to lose. He nodded once. They walked to the dock together. Jude took position at the tree line, sight lines covering the fire road, the clearing, and the southern bank. Pike and Garrett flanked the cabin, checking the structure for signs of recent entry. The morning was silent except for the river, a low, continuous murmur that sounded like a voice speaking through water, forming words that dissolved before they could be understood. The dock groaned under their weight. Ronan tested each plank before stepping, distributing his weight, feeling for the structural integrity of wood that had been softening for years. Eli moved beside him with the practiced confidence of a child who had walked this dock 100 times before, who knew which boards held and which ones flexed, who carried a muscle memory of this place that grief had preserved like amber preserving an insect. They reached the end. The water below was dark, tannin-stained, deep, moving with a slow current that pulled leaves and debris along the surface in long, lazy spirals. Eli knelt. He reached down between two planks where a gap had opened wide enough to fit an arm. His fingers disappeared into the space beneath the dock. The structural framework, the cross beams and supports that held the planks above the water. He reached deeper. His arm went in up to the elbow, then the shoulder. His cheek pressed against the cold wood. His eyes closed. He was searching by feel, his fingers mapping a space he couldn't see, looking for something his father had placed here years ago with hands that would never place anything again. "There," Eli whispered. He pulled. Something resisted, jammed, wedged, frozen in place by seasons of ice and rust. He pulled harder. His face contorted with effort. Ronan reached down beside him, got his fingers around what felt like a metal handle, and together they wrenched it free. A waterproof container. Military grade, the kind designed for field conditions, airtight, impact-resistant, roughly the size of a small toolbox. It was heavy. The latches were corroded but intact. The surface was coated in river slime and frozen condensation, but the seal, the rubber gasket around the lid, was unbroken. Eli held it in his lap. His arms were wet to the shoulder. His hands were shaking from cold and adrenaline and something deeper, the physical manifestation of a connection with his dead father that had just been renewed through an object hidden in the dark. Ronan knelt beside him. "Can I open it?" Eli nodded. The latches fought. Ronan used his pocket knife to pry corrosion from the hinge points, then forced them open one at a time. The lid separated from the base with the hiss of a broken seal, air that had been locked inside for years escaping in a single exhalation. Inside, wrapped in plastic bags sealed with duct tape, was a collection of items arranged with the methodical precision of a man who knew this might be the last copy of the most important work of his life. Duplicate journals, 3 composition notebooks filled with handwritten notes in a tight, precise hand, Photographs, dozens of them, printed on standard paper, showing documents, bank statements, meeting minutes, wire transfer receipts. 2 USB drives sealed in separate plastic bags, each labeled with a date and the words encrypted. Master key on drive B. And a single envelope, unsealed, containing a handwritten letter. Ronan didn't read the letter. It wasn't addressed to him. It was addressed to Eli. He handed it to the boy without a word. Eli took the envelope, looked at the handwriting, his father's handwriting, and his composure broke. Not dramatically, not with sobs or wails or the theatrical collapse of a movie scene. It broke the way real things break. Quietly, internally, a fault line shifting beneath a surface that had held for 2 years and could not hold for one more second. Tears ran down his face in straight lines, cutting through the dirt and grime, and he pressed the envelope against his chest and bent forward over the container and shook in silence. Ronan put his hand on the boy's back. He didn't speak. He didn't offer comfort in words because words were insufficient for this, for the grief of a child finding a message from a dead man who had loved him enough to hide the truth where only love could find it. They stayed like that for 30 seconds. A minute. The river murmured. The dock creaked. The sky stayed gray. Then Jude's voice cut through the silence. Sharp, urgent. A single word carrying the freight of 100 combat situations compressed into one syllable. Contact. Ronan's head snapped up. He looked toward the tree line where Jude was positioned. Vehicles. 3 of them. Coming down the fire road at a speed that said they weren't sightseeing. Black SUVs with tinted windows and no plates visible from this distance. The automotive equivalent of a blank face, designed to arrive without identity and leave without evidence. They hadn't come from town. The road from Ashridge approached from the south. These vehicles were coming from the north, from a direction that meant someone had known to circle around, to approach from the back, to cut off the route that Ronan would have used to retreat. Someone had known they were coming here. Someone had told them where to go. Ronan looked at the container in Eli's lap, looked at the vehicles, looked at the distance between the dock and the trucks, calculated time, speed, exposure. The math didn't work. The SUVs would reach the clearing before they could reach their vehicles. They were in the open, on a dock, on a river, with no cover and no concealment, and a 13-year-old boy holding the only evidence that could bring down a criminal empire. His phone buzzed. He pulled it out. A text from Dex. 7 words. Cutter made a call. 2 minutes ago. Ronan read the message. Read it again. Let the words assemble themselves into the shape of the truth he already knew. The cutter had watched them leave, had waited long enough to seem casual, and had then called the people who were now driving toward this clearing with the singular purpose of destroying everything Thomas Mercer had died to protect. 2 minutes. Cutter's call had been 2 minutes ago. The SUVs were already here, which meant they had been positioned nearby, waiting, staged, ready to move the moment Cutter confirmed the location. This wasn't a response. This was an ambush that had been set before they'd even left the clubhouse. The first SUV broke through the tree line into the clearing, then the second, then the third. They fanned out, a tactical deployment, blocking the fire road and the southern tree line, creating a perimeter that left only the river as an exit. Doors opened, men stepped out, 6 of them. Not law enforcement, no badges, no uniforms, no identification of any kind. They wore dark jackets and the blank expressions of professionals who had been paid to accomplish an objective and didn't need to understand or care about its moral dimensions. Ronan stood on the dock with Eli behind him, the waterproof container clutched in the boys' arms, the river at their backs, and the sum total of a dead man's final act of courage pressed against a living child's chest. Jude emerged from his tree line to Ronan's left, a wall of muscle and damage moving with the controlled aggression of a man who had been waiting his entire life for a moment exactly like this. Pike and Garrett appeared from behind the cabin, flanking right, creating a 3-point formation that covered the dock and the boy on it. 4 bikers, 6 professionals, 1 boy, 1 box of evidence, and somewhere behind all of it, behind the SUVs and the tree line and the frozen road and the miles of mountain between here and the clubhouse, a man named Cutter Briggs sat in a chair at a table he'd been given 19 years ago, waiting for a phone call that would confirm the evidence was destroyed and the problem was solved. The lead professional stopped 20 yards from the dock. He didn't draw a weapon. Didn't need to. The geometry of the situation was its own threat. The numbers, the positioning, the isolation. "The container," he said. His voice carried across the clearing the way sound carries over water. Flat, clear, emptied of everything except instruction. "Hand it over, and everyone leaves." Ronan looked at the man the way he had looked at every threat in every theater of war he had ever occupied, without fear, without anger, with the cold, absolute clarity of a man who had already made his decision and was merely waiting for the world to catch up with the consequences. "No," Ronan said. The word hung in the frozen air between them, and the silence that followed was the sound of every possible future narrowing down to one. The word "no" left Ronan's mouth and entered the clearing like a bullet enters a room, changing the physics of everything inside it. The 6 men standing in the frozen mud between their black SUVs shifted weight collectively, a subtle redistribution of balance that Ronan recognized from years of reading human bodies for intent. They hadn't expected resistance. They had expected numbers and isolation and the geometry of overwhelming force to do the talking for them. They had expected a handover, a transaction, the clean arithmetic of power against vulnerability. They hadn't expected a man who'd said no to worse things in worse places and was still standing. The lead professional, mid-30s, clean-shaven, wearing the particular kind of physical confidence that came from private military contracting or federal enforcement gone freelance, took one step forward. His right hand hung open at his side, not reaching for anything, not yet, but positioned. "I'm going to give you that opportunity one more time," the man said, "because I think maybe the cold is affecting your judgment." "My judgment's fine," Ronan said. "Your intel's the problem. Whoever told you we'd hand this over didn't understand what he was selling you." Behind Ronan, on the dock, Eli pressed the waterproof container harder against his chest. The boy's breathing was audible, short, ragged, the hyperventilation of a child whose adrenal system was firing on every cylinder. But he wasn't running. He was standing. Standing behind the man who had said no on his behalf, in the space between a stranger's courage and his father's buried truth. Jude moved, not toward the professionals, sideways along the tree line, closing the distance between himself and the dock. The movement was glacial, deliberate, the slow repositioning of a man who understood that sudden motion in a standoff was the match that lit the fuse. Pike and Garrett mirrored him from the right, tightening the formation around the dock's access point. 4 men creating a human wall between 6 threats and 1 child. The math still didn't work. Ronan knew it. Jude knew it. Everyone in that clearing knew it. 4 against 6 with a civilian to protect, and a river at your back wasn't a defensive position. It was a last stand. The kind of situation that ended in stories told about men who didn't survive to tell them. But Ronan had been in positions like this before. In Fallujah. In Helmand. In the back alleys of Norfolk when the drinking years had turned him into something that went looking for pain the way other men went looking for comfort. And the thing he had learned, the thing that couldn't be taught in any classroom or written in any manual, was that the math of a fight was never about numbers. It was about willingness. It was about which side was prepared to pay a price the other side couldn't afford. These men were professionals. They were paid, which meant their willingness had a ceiling, a number beyond which the compensation no longer justified the cost. They would push. They would threaten. They would apply pressure until the pressure reached a level that exceeded their contract. Ronan's willingness had no ceiling. It had been burned out of him years ago, in a convoy where his brother died, in a VA waiting room where nobody answered, in a series of empty apartments and emptier bottles that had stripped away every attachment to his own survival, until what remained was a single, irreducible principle. Protect the ones who can't protect themselves, and don't stop until you can't move. "Dex," Ronan said into the phone he'd kept open in his left hand. He didn't whisper. He wanted them to hear. "You're receiving?" "Receiving, recording, transmitting." Dex's voice came through the speaker, calm, clinical, the tone of a man sitting at a keyboard 14 miles away who had already begun the process that would make this standoff visible to people far beyond this clearing. Live feed to 3 separate cloud servers. Encryption active. Geolocation tagged. If anything happens at that clearing, The footage is already somewhere they can't reach. The lead professional's jaw tightened. A fraction, a millimeter of muscle contraction that betrayed the first crack in the professional composure. The recognition that the variables had changed, that this was no longer an isolated event in an abandoned clearing, but a documented encounter with a digital trail that led to servers they couldn't burn and records they couldn't erase. "You're bluffing," the man said. "Try me." Ronan lifted the phone higher. "Smile for the cloud." A pause. 3 seconds. 5. The kind of pause that contains an entire recalculation, costs reassessed, risks reweighed, the internal negotiation between the instruction they'd been given and the price they were now being asked to pay. The lead professional looked at his team. Something passed between them. Not a word, not a signal, but a communication that lived in the shared vocabulary of men who operated together. An agreement. A decision. He stepped back. "This isn't over," he said. "For you it is," Ronan replied. The men returned to their vehicles with the controlled withdrawal of professionals preserving the option to re-engage. Doors closed. Engines started. The 3 SUVs reversed up the fire road in sequence, first, second, third, and disappeared into the tree line with a precision that confirmed what Ronan already knew. These were trained operators. They followed orders. And the man giving those orders was not in this clearing. The man giving those orders was sitting in a comfortable office somewhere, watching his phone, waiting for confirmation that the last piece of evidence linking him to a multi-million-dollar fraud had been destroyed. That confirmation wasn't coming. Ronan exhaled. The breath left his body in a cloud that hung in the air for a moment before the cold tore it apart. His hands were shaking, not from fear, not from cold, but from the chemical aftermath of sustained adrenaline, the body's delayed reaction to a threat that the mind had refused to acknowledge while the threat was active. "Move," he said. "Now, before they regroup." They loaded the container into the truck. Eli climbed into the passenger seat, his arms wrapped around the box, his face streaked with tears and frozen river water. Jude took the wheel of the second truck. Pike and Garrett flanked the convoy, one in the bed of each vehicle, watching the tree line with the patient aggression of men who had spent years waiting for things to come out of tree lines. Ronan drove. Fast. The fire road punished the truck's suspension, and every rut and frozen ridge sent shockwaves through the frame that he felt in his teeth and his spine and the titanium plate in his forearm. The trees blurred. The river appeared and disappeared through gaps in the forest. The sky stayed gray, a ceiling of cloud that had no intention of breaking. His phone rang. Dex. Cutter just made another call, same VoIP relay, 60 seconds ago. He knows they failed. He knows. And Ronan, Cutter just left the clubhouse, took his personal vehicle, heading north on Route 7. North. Toward them. "He's running to Hale," Ronan said. "If he gets there before we can—" "Deck's already moving. He sent Wraith and Boone after Cutter. They're 3 minutes behind him." Ronan processed the information while the truck bounced over frozen ground at a speed that violated every principle of safe driving and several laws of physics. Cutter was running. Which meant Cutter knew the game was over, that the evidence had been recovered, that his betrayal was exposed or about to be, and that his only remaining play was to reach Hale before the Iron Veil could use what they'd found. But Cutter wasn't the priority. Cutter was a symptom. Hale was the disease, and somewhere in Hale's reach, Eli's mother was being held. "Dex, the mother, you have anything?" "I've been running property records on every entity connected to Hale's network. Ridgeline Properties manages 4 rental units in the county. 3 are occupied by legitimate tenants. The 4th, a farmhouse on Miller Creek Road, 6 miles south of town, has been listed as vacant for 18 months. But the utility records show continuous electrical usage. Someone's been paying the power bill on a property that's supposedly empty. That's where she is. It's where I'd put someone I needed to keep quiet but alive. Rural, isolated, no neighbors within half a mile. And it's owned through a trust that traces back to, guess who, Ridgeline Asset Group." Ronan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The leather groaned, his knuckles whitened. 6 miles south of town. They were 9 miles north. The math was simple. 15 miles of mountain road between him and the woman whose son was sitting next to him, holding a dead man's legacy in his arms. Send the address to Deck. Tell him to send everyone who isn't chasing Cutter to Miller Creek Road. I'm heading there now. Ronan, there might be security. There will be security. Send them anyway. He turned the truck. The tires screamed against frozen gravel, and the vehicle slid sideways for a heart-stopping second before the treads caught and the truck lurched forward onto the county road. In the rearview mirror, Jude's truck followed. Matching speed, matching trajectory. The second vehicle falling into formation with the unconscious synchronization of men who had operated together long enough that coordination had become autonomic. Eli looked at Ronan. The boy's face was gray with cold and exhaustion, but his eyes burned with something that couldn't be extinguished by either. We're going to get my mom? Yeah. How do you know where she is? Because bad men need quiet places, and quiet places leave traces that smart men can find. Eli looked at the container in his lap, at his father's handwriting on the sealed envelope he still hadn't opened, at the notebooks and photographs and encrypted drives that represented everything Thomas Mercer had spent the last months of his life compiling, the evidence that had gotten him killed and was now, 2 years later, about to bring down the man who had ordered it. My dad wasn't a fighter, Eli said quietly. He was small. He wore glasses. He couldn't change a tire without the manual. Mom used to tease him about it. She'd say he was the only man in Virginia who needed instructions to open a jar of pickles. Ronan didn't respond. He let the boy talk. Sometimes the most important thing you could do for someone in crisis was not fill the silence they needed to fill themselves. But he was brave, Eli continued. He was brave in a way I didn't understand until now. He didn't fight with his hands. He fought with what he knew. He wrote things down. He followed the money. He kept asking questions that nobody wanted him to ask, and he didn't stop even when he knew it was dangerous. The boy's voice cracked. He pressed his palm flat against the container's lid, touching it the way you touch a headstone, with the full weight of every word you never got to say. He hid this for me. Not for the police, not for the newspapers, for me. Because he knew. He knew I'd come back to the dock. He knew I'd remember where we fished. He knew I'd be the one to find it. Ronan looked at the boy, at the tears cutting channels through the grime on his face, at the fierce, defiant set of his jaw, a jaw that belonged to a 13-year-old but carried the tension of a man who had just accepted a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. Your dad was right, Ronan said. You did find it, but I didn't find it alone. The words landed somewhere in Ronan's chest, in the space between Danny's dog tags and the scar tissue that surrounded his heart. He didn't respond. He couldn't. Because the boy had said something that Ronan had needed to hear for 7 years without knowing it. That the act of protection wasn't solitary. That helping someone wasn't a one-directional gift, but a circuit that completed itself. That Eli had needed Ronan and Ronan had needed Eli, and the truth that connected them was older and simpler than either of them could name. The truck hit the county road and accelerated. 40, 50, 60 miles per hour on a road rated for 35. The engine straining, the frame shuddering, the frozen landscape blurring into a smear of gray and brown, and the dark green of pines that flashed past like fence posts counting down the distance to whatever waited at Miller Creek Road. Ronan's phone buzzed, a text from Deck. Wraith and Boone have Cutter. Pulled him over on Route 7. He's not going anywhere. Then a second text, seconds later. Cutter talked. Hale's people have the mother at the farmhouse, 2 men guarding her. Cutter says Hale is there personally. He came to oversee the destruction of the lockbox evidence. He doesn't know about the cabin copies. He thinks the only evidence left is what was in the box. Hale was at the farmhouse. The man behind everything, the fraud, the shell companies, the bought officials, the death of Thomas Mercer, was physically present at the location where Eli's mother was being held. He had come to personally ensure that the last traces of his crime were erased and the last witnesses were silenced. He didn't know he was already too late. Ronan floored the accelerator. Miller Creek Road was a gravel artery that branched off the county road 3 miles south of Ashridge and wound through a hollow so narrow the trees on either side nearly touched overhead. The farmhouse sat at the end, a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and a detached barn, set back from the road by 100 yards of dead grass and frozen mud. Two vehicles were parked in front, a silver sedan and a black Range Rover with plates that Ronan memorized in the time it took his brain to process the image. He stopped the truck 200 yards short of the property, where the road curved and the tree line provided concealment. Jude's truck pulled in behind him. Doors opened quietly. Not slammed, not shut, but pulled closed with the careful pressure of men who understood that sound carried farther in cold air, and that surprise was worth more than speed. Jude appeared at Ronan's window. His face was the same face it always was, a topographic map of damage and endurance, but his eyes were different, bright, focused. The eyes of a man who had found the specific frequency of purpose that made everything else fall away. "2 vehicles," Jude said. 2 confirmed guards, plus Hale. That's at least 3, maybe more. Dex sending backup. ETA unknown. "Then we don't wait." Ronan looked at Eli. The boy was gripping the container, his knuckles white, his breathing shallow. "Eli, you stay in this truck. You lock the doors. You do not move until I come back for you. Do you understand?" "But my mom..." "Your mom needs me to focus on getting her out. I can't do that if I'm worrying about you. Stay in the truck. Lock the doors." Eli's eyes searched Ronan's face, looking for reassurance, for certainty, for the promise that this man who had appeared in his life 12 hours ago would keep the one he hadn't made, but both of them understood. "You'll bring her back," Eli said. Not a question. Ronan held the boy's gaze, Danny's dog tags pressed against his chest, cold metal on warm skin, the permanent weight of a brother he hadn't been able to save. "I'll bring her back." He stepped out of the truck, closed the door, heard the locks engage behind him, a small, mechanical sound that carried the weight of a child's trust. Jude, Pike, and Garrett formed around him without instruction. 4 men standing in the frozen shadow of the tree line, breathing clouds into the morning air, their bodies running on caffeine and adrenaline and the sustaining power of a purpose that had calcified into something harder than fatigue could erode. They moved through the trees, single file, Jude on point, despite his prosthetic. The man moved through rough terrain with a fluidity that defied his hardware. Each step precise, weight distributed, the gait of someone who had rebuilt his relationship with the ground from scratch and made it better than the original. Pike and Garrett flanked. Ronan brought up the rear, watching their 6, scanning the tree line behind them for movement. The farmhouse grew larger as they approached. Paint peeling, shutters broken. The porch sagged under the weight of neglect. But the windows on the ground floor showed light, faint, yellow, the glow of lamps behind drawn curtains. Someone was inside. Someone was keeping a woman in a house that wasn't hers, in a room she couldn't leave, waiting for a man with a white-teeth smile to decide whether she lived or died. Jude reached the edge of the tree line and stopped. He held up a fist. Everyone froze. A man stood on the front porch, heavy jacket, hands in pockets, scanning the property with the bored vigilance of a guard who didn't expect trouble and had stopped looking for it 3 hours ago. He was smoking. The orange glow of the cigarette traced small arcs in the darkness as he brought it to his lips and back down. Jude turned, made eye contact with Ronan, held up one finger, one guard visible, then pointed to the barn. Through the gap between the farmhouse and the outbuilding, a second figure was visible, leaning against the barn door, also smoking, also bored, also occupying the particular posture of a man doing a job he considered beneath him. 2 guards, external. Which meant anyone else, Hale included, was inside. Ronan pointed to Pike and Garrett, then pointed to the barn. The 2 former rangers peeled off without a word, moving through the tree line in a wide arc that would bring them to the barn from the east side, out of the porch guard's sight line. Ronan looked at Jude, pointed to the porch. Jude nodded. They moved together, 2 men covering open ground in the gray half-light, moving low, using the dead grass and the frozen furrows of the yard as minimal concealment. 20 yards, 15, 10. The porch guard flicked his cigarette into the mud, turned to go inside. Jude was on the steps before the man's hand touched the door handle. The engagement was silent, fast. The kind of controlled violence that leaves no time for sound. Jude's hand closing over the guard's mouth, his forearm locking against the man's throat, his weight driving the man backward into the porch railing with enough force to empty his lungs but not enough to break the wood. The guard fought, hands clawing, legs kicking, but Jude was 240 pounds of trained aggression operating on a principle that superseded pain, fatigue, and the mechanical limitations of a body that was held together by titanium and fury. 8 seconds. The guard went limp. Not dead, unconscious. Jude lowered him to the porch floor with the same care a parent uses to lay a sleeping child in a crib, which was either deeply compassionate or deeply unsettling, depending on your perspective. From the direction of the barn, a soft thud, then silence. Pike and Garrett had handled the second guard with the same efficient brutality. The front door was unlocked. Ronan pushed it open. The hinges didn't creak. Someone had oiled them recently, which meant someone had been using this door regularly, which meant this wasn't an abandoned property being temporarily repurposed. This was an established location, a facility, maintained and ready. The interior smelled like mildew and heating oil and the stale chemical scent of processed food, microwave meals eaten in rooms with no ventilation. The hallway was dark, doors on both sides, closed, silent. At the end of the hall, a sliver of light escaped from beneath a door that was slightly ajar. Ronan moved down the hallway. His boots were silent on the warped hardwood. Years of moving through buildings where sound meant death had given him a relationship with floors that bordered on spiritual. He felt the boards before he stepped on them, testing for flex, for creak, for the betrayal of old wood under heavy weight. He reached the door, pushed it open with one hand. The room was a kitchen. Large, farmhouse style, with a long wooden table and a single hanging bulb that turned everything the color of old parchment. A woman sat at the table. Her wrists were zip-tied to the chair's arms. Her face was swollen on the left side, a bruise that had bloomed from her cheekbone to her temple in shades of purple and yellow. Her hair was matted, her eyes were red-rimmed and dry, the eyes of a woman who had cried until the tears ran out and then kept crying without them. Sarah Mercer, Eli's mother. She looked up when the door opened. Her body flinched, the full-body recoil of someone who had learned in the last 24 hours that opening doors meant pain. But when she saw Ronan, the leather vest, the scars, the expression of a man who had come to take her home, something changed in her face. Not hope, not yet, but the precursor to hope, the moment when despair cracks just enough to let light in. "Eli," she whispered. "Where's Eli?" "Safe. He's safe. He's in a truck 200 yards from here with the doors locked." Her body shuddered, a single convulsive tremor that ran from her shoulders to her feet, the physical release of a terror that had been compressed inside her for hours, held in check by the primal need to stay functional in case her son needed her. Ronan pulled his knife and cut the zip ties. The plastic fell away from her wrists, revealing raw, abraded skin, the evidence of hours of struggle against restraints that didn't yield. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Then we're leaving, right now." He helped her stand. She was unsteady, dehydrated, exhausted, disoriented by the sudden transition from captive to rescued, but her legs held. She gripped Ronan's arm with both hands, her fingers digging into the leather with a strength that seemed disproportionate to her frame, the desperate hold of a woman who had decided that this stranger was the rope she would not let go of. They were 3 steps from the kitchen door when the voice came from behind them. "I wouldn't." Ronan stopped. His body registered the voice before his mind processed it. A spike of adrenaline, a tightening of every muscle, the full system alert of a man who had just been flanked in a building he thought he'd cleared. He turned. Victor Hale stood in the doorway of a side room that Ronan hadn't checked, a pantry or closet that connected to the kitchen, through a second entrance he hadn't seen in the dark. Hale was wearing a wool overcoat. His hands were in his pockets. His face was the same face Eli had recognized at the rally. Handsome, composed, the practiced warmth of a man whose entire existence was a performance designed to make you trust him. But the eyes were different now. The warmth was gone. What remained was the cold, steady focus of a man who had run out of options and was now operating on the only currency he had left: control. You must be the biker, Hale said. His voice was conversational, calm, the tone of a man discussing weather. I've heard about you, Ronan Voss. 3 deployments, Purple Heart, honorable discharge. Joined a motorcycle club because the VA couldn't give you what you needed and the bottle almost killed you. He paused. I know everything about you. I've known since the boy grabbed your sleeve at the rally. Then you know I'm not leaving without her. What I know is that you've made a series of decisions over the past 24 hours that have put you and your club in a position that has no clean exit. You broke into a private property. You assaulted 2 of my employees. You're standing in a house that I own, holding a woman I could claim was here voluntarily, and the only witness to any wrongdoing is a traumatized 13-year-old whose father's death was ruled an accident by the county sheriff's office. An office you bought. Hale's expression didn't change. That's a serious accusation. I've got serious evidence, duplicate journals, financial records, encrypted drives, everything Thomas Mercer compiled before you had his car run off the road, everything you thought was in the lockbox. He made copies, hid them where you'd never look, and we found them this morning. For the first time, something shifted in Hale's face. Not panic. Men like Hale didn't panic, but a recalculation. The rapid processing of new information against existing assumptions, the realization that the model he'd been operating under, the model in which the lockbox was the only copy and its destruction meant safety, was wrong. Even if that's true, Hale said, and his voice remained steady, but the muscles around his jaw had tightened. Evidence obtained by vigilantes through trespass and theft has no standing in court. Your journals, your drives, your photographs, all inadmissible. A first-year law student could have them thrown out before lunch. Maybe, but the forensic accounting doesn't need a chain of custody to be true. Once investigators know where to look, once they have the account numbers, the routing information, the names of every official you've been paying, they'll find their own evidence, clean evidence, the kind that comes with warrants and subpoenas and the full weight of a federal investigation that doesn't need my copies because your network left digital fingerprints in 100 databases you can't erase. Hale stared at Ronan. The kitchen light cast shadows across his face that made him look older, harder, stripped of the philanthropic polish that had been his armor for years. Underneath the overcoat and the expensive watch and the Georgetown MBA was something much simpler and much more dangerous. A man who had built an empire on deception and was watching it collapse in real time. You think you've won, Hale said quietly. I think your men drove away from that clearing because they saw a camera. I think your bought deputy couldn't make a missing mother report stick for more than 6 hours. I think your man inside our club is sitting in the back of a pickup truck right now telling 2 very angry bikers everything he knows. And I think you're standing in a kitchen with no guards, no leverage, and nowhere to go. Hale removed his hands from his pockets. Slowly. They were empty. I could disappear, right now. Walk out that door, drive to an airport, be in a country without extradition by tomorrow morning. I've planned for this contingency. There are accounts they'll never find, identities they'll never trace. You could, Ronan said. But you won't. Why not? Because the man who built what you built, the man who spent years buying people and destroying anyone who got close to the truth, that man doesn't run. He doubles down. He fights. He calculates one more move, one more play, one more angle that might save him. Because admitting it's over is harder than anything else for someone like you. Hale's jaw tightened. The tendons in his neck stood out. And for one long, terrible moment, Ronan saw something behind the composed exterior that he recognized. The same wild, cornered desperation he'd seen in men on the battlefield who'd realized that the position was lost but couldn't stop fighting because fighting was the only thing they knew. Then the sound of engines. Multiple. Coming up Miller Creek Road, growing louder with every second, the deep, unmistakable rumble of Harley-Davidsons ridden at speed, a sound that started as vibration and built into a roar that shook the farmhouse windows and rattled the hanging light in the kitchen until the shadows on the walls trembled. December. The Iron Veil. Every available brother, riding through the dawn toward a farmhouse at the end of a dead-end road, converging on a moment that had been building for 24 hours, or 2 years, or the entire lifetime of a dead journalist's son who had grabbed a stranger's sleeve and said 7 words that changed everything. The engines grew louder, closer. The sound filled the kitchen, filled the house, filled the hollow, filled the space between Ronan and Hale until there was no room left for calculation or escape or the kind of quiet disappearance that men like Victor Hale had always relied on. Through the kitchen window, headlights appeared. 1 set, 2, 5, 10. Bikes pouring down the road, their lights cutting through the gray morning like blades, their engines shaking the frozen ground. Hale looked at the window. At the lights? At the army arriving for a war he had already lost. Sarah Mercer stood behind Ronan, her hand still gripping his arm, her bruised face turned toward the man who had taken her from her home and held her in this kitchen while her son searched for the truth his father had died to protect. "Thomas knew," she said. Her voice was raw, stripped, the voice of a woman who had been silent for too long and had nothing left to lose by speaking. "He knew everything, and you killed him for it. But you didn't kill what he knew. You couldn't, because he gave it to the only person in the world you'd never think to look at. A 13-year-old boy who loved his father enough to remember where they used to fish." Hale's face collapsed. Not all at once. In stages, like a building coming down floor by floor. The composure went first, then the calculation, then the control. What remained was a man standing in a kitchen in a house he owned, surrounded by the sound of engines belonging to men he had underestimated, facing a truth he had spent years and millions trying to bury. The front door opened. Deck's boots hit the hallway floor, heavy, deliberate, the footsteps of a man who had crossed his last line and was done with the distance between intention and action. Behind him, the sound of more boots. More men. The iron veil filling the farmhouse like water filling a vessel, occupying every space, every doorway, every shadow. Deck appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Hale, looked at Sarah Mercer, looked at the cut zip ties on the floor, looked at Ronan. "Deputies are 4 minutes out," Deck said. "Real ones. State police. Deck's made the calls. They're coming with warrants." Ronan nodded. His hand found Danny's dog tags through his shirt, pressed them against his chest, felt the cold metal warm against his skin. 4 minutes. 240 seconds between the moment everything converged and the moment it became the law's problem instead of theirs. 240 seconds of holding a line they had crossed 24 hours ago when a boy whispered 7 words to a stranger. Hale didn't move, didn't run, didn't fight. He stood in the kitchen of his own property, under his own light, wearing his own expensive clothes, and watched the architecture of his life disassemble itself around him with the slow, irreversible precision of something that had been falling for a very long time and had only just now hit the ground. Through the kitchen window, the morning light finally broke through the clouds. A single shaft of pale gold that cut through the gray and landed on the frozen yard where a dozen Harleys now sat in a ragged line, their engines ticking as they cooled, their chrome catching the light and throwing it back in fragments that scattered across the mud and the dead grass and the face of a man who had run out of rooms to hide in. Sirens rose in the distance, and Ronan Voss stood in the doorway between a criminal and the woman he had come to save, and he didn't move, and he didn't speak, and he didn't need to. Because the sound of those sirens was the sound of a story that had been silent for 2 years finally being heard, and the only thing left to do was stand there and let the truth walk through the door. It had been locked behind for far too long. The sirens arrived before the sun finished breaking through. 3 Virginia State Police cruisers came down Miller Creek Road in a column that scattered gravel against the tree trunks and sent a flock of starlings exploding from the dead oak at the edge of the property. Behind them, an unmarked sedan carrying 2 federal investigators that Dex had reached through a contact at the Bureau's Richmond field office, a former Army intelligence colleague who owed him the kind of favor that gets repaid with a single phone call and no questions asked. Ronan watched from the farmhouse porch as the vehicles emptied. Uniforms, badges, the crisp procedural choreography of law enforcement taking possession of a scene, yellow tape, perimeter markers, the controlled urgency of men and women who had been briefed on the drive and were now converting information into action. 2 troopers entered the farmhouse. 2 more secured the vehicles in the driveway. The federal investigators, a man and a woman, both wearing the particular expression of people who had seen enough to be unsurprised but not enough to be numb, walked directly to Ronan. "You're Voss?" the woman asked. She was mid-40s, short hair, the handshake of someone who'd learned to make first impressions count in rooms full of people who didn't take her seriously. Yeah. Special Agent Lena Caldwell, this is Agent Peralta. We've been briefed on the financial evidence your associate transmitted. Where's the physical material? In a truck 200 yards up the road. With the boy. Caldwell nodded. Her eyes moved past Ronan to the farmhouse door where two troopers were escorting Victor Hale down the porch steps. Hale walked with his chin up and his hands cuffed behind his back, maintaining the posture of a man attending a function he considered beneath him. The overcoat hung open. The expensive watch caught the early light. His face had reassembled itself into something approaching composure. The mask repaired, the cracks plastered over. The performance resumed even as the audience had stopped believing. He didn't look at Ronan as he passed, didn't acknowledge the bikers standing along the driveway, their vests and patches and scarred hands forming a corridor of silent witness. He looked straight ahead, at the cruiser, at the door being opened for him, at the seat where he would sit while the infrastructure he'd built was dismantled piece by piece. Sarah Mercer sat on the porch steps with a blanket around her shoulders that Pike had retrieved from one of the trucks. A paramedic was examining the bruise on her face, tilting her chin gently toward the light, asking questions in the soft, measured tone of someone trained to assess damage without inflicting more. Sarah answered in monosyllables. Yes, she could see clearly. No, she hadn't lost consciousness. Yes, the pain was manageable. Her eyes weren't on the paramedic. They were on the road, scanning, searching, locked on the curve where the gravel disappeared behind the trees. Waiting for her son. Ronan walked to the truck. 200 yards of frozen ground that felt longer than any distance he'd covered in 3 combat deployments. His body was shutting down, the adrenaline metabolized, the caffeine worn thin, the accumulated debt of 30 hours without sleep pressing on his nervous system like a hand on a dimmer switch, turning everything down by degrees. His left forearm throbbed where the titanium plate sat against bone that had never fully forgiven the shrapnel that broke it. His knees ached. His back was a geography of tension that would take days to release, if it released at all. He reached the truck, knocked on the window. Eli's face appeared behind the glass, pale, streaked, enormous eyes in a thin face. The boy saw Ronan and his hand moved immediately to the door lock. The click was audible in the morning quiet. Your mom's okay, Ronan said. She's on the porch. Paramedics checking her out. She's asking for you. Eli didn't speak. He opened the door, slid out of the truck with the container still pressed against his chest, and stood on the frozen ground in shoes too thin for the cold, looking up at Ronan with an expression that contained everything a 13-year-old could feel and no words sufficient to express any of it. Then he ran. He ran down the road with the container bouncing against his body, his too big jacket flapping behind him, his breath forming a trail of white clouds that hung in the air like punctuation marks in a sentence he was writing with his feet. He ran the way children run toward the thing they need most, without technique, without pacing, without anything except the raw, combustive fuel of relief and terror and love and the desperate need to confirm with his own hands and eyes that the person he loved most in the world was still there. Sarah saw him before he reached the porch. She stood. The blanket fell from her shoulders. She took one step forward, then another, and then she was off the porch and moving toward her son with the same graceless, beautiful urgency, and they collided in the middle of the frozen yard with an impact that was silent and total, arms wrapping, bodies folding, two people who had been separated by violence finding each other in a space where violence couldn't follow. Ronan watched from the road. He didn't approach. This wasn't his moment. It belonged to a mother and her son, and to the dead man whose hidden truth had made the reunion possible. He stood with his hands at his sides and his boots on frozen ground, and he watched them hold each other, and something inside his chest shifted. Not broke, not healed, but shifted. The way a bone that's been set wrong finally moves toward alignment after years of carrying the distortion. Jude appeared beside him. The big man said nothing. He didn't need to. He stood with the same stillness he always carried, a mountain of scar tissue and titanium, watching a woman hold her son in a yard full of police cruisers and Harleys and the debris of a nightmare that was finally, slowly, ending. "You good?" Jude asked after a long time. Ronan thought about the question, turned it over, examined it from the angles that mattered. "No," he said, "but I'm better." Jude nodded. That was enough. The next 3 hours were procedural. The federal agents took possession of the waterproof container and its contents, the journals, the photographs, the encrypted drives, the letter Eli still hadn't opened. They documented everything with the meticulous thoroughness of people who understood that chain of custody was the difference between a conviction and an acquittal. Ronan gave a statement. Jude gave a statement. Pike and Garrett gave statements. Each man recounted the events of the past 24 hours with the spare, factual precision of former military personnel who had been debriefed before and understood that accuracy mattered more than narrative. Sarah Mercer gave her statement in the back of an ambulance, with Eli sitting beside her, his hand in hers, refusing to let go even when the paramedic needed to check her blood pressure. She told them everything. How the men had come to the house while Eli was at the rally. How they had searched methodically, professionally, taking only the lockbox and leaving everything else arranged to look undisturbed. How they had put her in a car with a hood over her head and driven her to the farmhouse. How Victor Hale had arrived 3 hours later and sat across from her at the kitchen table and asked her, in his calm, conversational voice, what her husband had known and who he had told. She had told him nothing, not because she was brave, though she was, not because she was defiant, though she was that too, but because she genuinely didn't know. Thomas had kept the details of his investigation from her. He had protected her the only way he knew how, by ensuring that if someone came asking questions, she would have no answers to give. The information she didn't possess had been her shield, and the irony of it, that a dead man's secrecy had saved his wife's life, was the kind of cruel, beautiful logic that the world specialized in. Cutter Briggs was taken into custody at 8:14 a.m. Wraith and Boone had held him on the side of Route 7 until state police arrived. He went quietly, not with the defiant composure of Hale, but with the collapsed, hollowed-out surrender of a man who had been carrying a secret that had finally become too heavy to hold. He didn't look at the Iron Veil brothers who had come to watch. He didn't speak. He sat in the back of the cruiser with his hands cuffed and his head bowed, and his 19-year history with the club reduced to a silence that said everything words couldn't. Ronan didn't watch Cutter being driven away. He couldn't. Not because of anger, though the anger was there, deep and cold and permanent, but because looking at Cutter meant looking at the failure of something he had believed in, and that failure was too close to other failures he carried, other betrayals he'd survived, other moments when trust had been extended and returned broken. Danny's death, the convoy, the report he'd never believed, the system that had failed at every level to protect the people it was supposed to serve. He sat on the tailgate of Jude's truck instead, in the parking lot of a gas station 3 miles from the farmhouse, and drank coffee from a styrofoam cup that burned his fingers and tasted like it had been brewed during the previous administration. The morning had warmed to 34 degrees, still cold, but the frost was melting now, turning the parking lot into a mosaic of wet asphalt and dirty ice. Deck found him there. The old man walked across the lot with the careful, measured gait of someone whose body was reminding him of every year it had logged and every injury it had cataloged. He sat on the tailgate next to Ronan. The truck's suspension groaned under their combined weight. Neither spoke for a long time. "How long did you know?" Ronan finally asked. "About Cutter?" "Yeah," Deck exhaled. The breath was long, slow, weighted with something heavier than air. "I didn't know, not the way you think, but I—" He stopped, started again. The restart was the most human thing Ronan had ever seen from a man who made decisions the way other people made fists, hard, fast, without hesitation. "I noticed things. Over the past year, small things. Cutter voting against involvement in situations that should have been unanimous. Cutter pushing back on community outreach that would have put us in contact with people asking questions about charitable spending in the county. Cutter arguing for the club to stay quiet, stay small, stay out of things that weren't our business. You noticed, and you didn't. I noticed, and I told myself it was caution. Told myself Cutter was being the voice of reason in a room full of men who sometimes let their hearts run ahead of their heads. Told myself that 19 years of brotherhood meant more than a feeling I couldn't prove." Deck's voice cracked again, that same hairline fracture Ronan had heard in the office, running deeper now, reaching places that wouldn't repair easily. I was wrong. I chose loyalty over instinct, and a woman spent 24 hours zip-tied to a chair because of it. You didn't put her in that chair. I didn't stop the man who helped. Ronan looked at Deck, at the scar, at the gray hair, at the hands that had built the iron veil from a group of broken veterans into something that, for all its flaws and contradictions, had just saved a boy and his mother from a man who had killed to protect his secrets. December Cutter made his choice. He sold the club. He sold us. That's on him, not on you. He was my brother. He was. And now he's not. That's the cost. Deck stared at the parking lot, at the melting ice, at the trucks and bikes and the road that led back to a clubhouse where one chair at the table would now sit empty, where one name would never be spoken the same way again, where the brotherhood would carry a scar that would heal but never disappear. The cost, Deck repeated. He said it like he was tasting something bitter. Yeah, I suppose that's exactly what it is. They sat in silence while the morning continued its slow, indifferent progression. Cars passed on the county road. A school bus rumbled by with faces in the windows too young to understand what had happened in their town overnight. The gas station attendant came out to change the price sign, adjusted the numbers with a long pole, and went back inside without looking at the two men sitting on the tailgate of a truck in his parking lot, holding coffee cups and carrying the weight of a world that had changed shape while most people slept. The investigation unfolded over the following weeks with the grinding, methodical pace of federal machinery that moves slowly but moves completely. Thomas Mercer's duplicate evidence proved to be everything Dex had hoped and Hale had feared, a comprehensive, meticulously documented trail connecting the Hale Foundation's charitable donations to a network of shell organizations that had laundered nearly $3 million over 4 years. The encrypted drives contained financial records that forensic accountants would later describe as remarkably thorough for a one-man investigation. Thomas Mercer had been a better investigator than anyone had known. He had followed the money through layers of corporate obfuscation that would have defeated most professionals, and he had done it alone, from a small house in rural Virginia, using public records and a reporter's instinct, and the stubborn refusal to stop asking questions that powerful people didn't want asked. The bought officials fell one by one. Deputy Glenn Foley was arrested at his $250,000 house in Staunton and charged with obstruction and conspiracy. The county health administrator, the school board member, and a state inspector were indicted on related charges within the month. Each one had received payments from Ridgeline Asset Group in exchange for their silence, their inaction, or their active participation in maintaining the fiction that Victor Hale was what he appeared to be. Hale himself was held without bail. The charges filled 14 pages: fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, kidnapping, and accessory to the wrongful death of Thomas Mercer. The last charge was the one that mattered most to Ronan because it acknowledged what the original investigation had denied: that Thomas Mercer's death was not an accident, that a man had been killed for telling the truth, that the system had not only failed to protect him, but had actively participated in erasing the evidence of his murder. The stolen charitable funds, the donations meant for veteran housing, job training, and community programs were identified, traced, and eventually recovered. Not all of them. Not immediately. But enough to matter. Enough to reopen programs that had closed when the money disappeared. Enough to restart services that struggling families and forgotten veterans had depended on before Hale's network siphoned them away. Cutter Briggs cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. He told them everything: how Hale had approached him 18 months ago, how the payments had started small and grown, how the requests had escalated from information about the club's activities to active sabotage of any investigation that came too close. He never spoke to Deck again. He never spoke to any member of the Iron Veil again. The chair at the table was removed, not replaced, just removed. An empty space where a brother had sat, left open as a reminder that trust was not a permanent condition and that the price of betrayal was subtracted not from the betrayer, but from everyone who had believed in him. 3 months after the farmhouse, on a Saturday morning in February that was cold but clear, the kind of winter day where the sky is so blue it looks artificial and the mountains stand against it like monuments to something permanent, the town of Ashridge held a small ceremony in the community center on Main Street. It wasn't much. A podium, a microphone that squealed when anyone stood too close, folding chairs arranged in rows that were mostly full. The county commissioner spoke. The new sheriff, appointed after the previous one resigned amid the investigation, spoke. A representative from the veterans organization that had received the largest share of recovered funds spoke, and her voice broke twice during her 3-minute address, and nobody in the room judged her for it. Eli Mercer sat in the front row with his mother. He was wearing a button-down shirt that was too big for him, probably his father's, and his hair had been cut short and his shoes were clean, and he looked like what he was, a boy who had been through something that no child should endure and had come out the other side carrying the particular kind of strength that is only forged in fire. Sarah sat beside him. The bruise on her face had healed, but the shadow of it remained, a faint discoloration that makeup couldn't quite cover, a physical memory that the skin carried even after the damage had repaired. She held Eli's hand. She held it the way she had held it in the frozen yard of the farmhouse, tightly, completely, with the desperate tenderness of a woman who had learned that the people you love can be taken from you and that the only response is to hold them harder. When the speeches ended and the applause faded and the crowd began to stand and drift toward the coffee and pastries set up on folding tables along the wall, Eli slipped away from his mother and walked to the back of the room. Ronan was standing near the exit. He had come late, entering after the ceremony started, taking a position against the back wall where the overhead lights didn't reach and where he could watch without being watched. He wore his vest, the iron veil patch, the road captain insignia, the leather that smelled like highway and engine oil, and the accumulated miles of a life lived in motion. His arms were crossed. His face carried its usual expression, the flat, guarded look of a man who had seen too much to be surprised and felt too much to stop caring. Eli stopped in front of him. The boy looked up. Ronan looked down. "You didn't come up front," Eli said. "Wasn't my place." "They wanted to thank you. The commissioner had a whole speech." "I heard it from back here. It was fine." Eli studied Ronan's face with the intensity of a child who has learned to read adults the hard way, not from books or instruction, but from necessity, from the survival imperative of understanding what the people around him were feeling before they felt it. "You don't like being thanked," Eli said. "Not much." "Why?" Ronan uncrossed his arms, looked at the crowd, the neighbors, the veterans, the families who were learning for the first time what had been done with the money that was supposed to help them. Looked at Sarah, who was talking to the new sheriff with the cautious body language of a woman who hadn't yet decided whether law enforcement was something she could trust again. Looked at the room, the folding chairs, the bad microphone, the coffee and styrofoam cups, and saw in it the imperfect, fragile, stubbornly persistent machinery of a community trying to repair itself. "Because thanking someone means it's over," Ronan said. "And I'm not sure it's over." "What do you mean?" "I mean your dad spent years fighting something most people didn't even know existed. He didn't do it for thanks. He did it because the truth mattered to him more than his own safety. And now you're the one who has to decide what that means. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. What his work meant, what his sacrifice meant, what you're going to do with the fact that you're alive and he's not, and the world is a little bit better because of what he did." Eli was quiet for a long time. The noise of the reception continued around them. Conversation, laughter, the clink of coffee cups, the small sounds of ordinary life resuming after catastrophe. "I read his letter," Eli said. "Yeah?" "He said he was sorry for not being there, for not being the dad who coaches baseball and fixes the sink and shows up at school plays. He said he tried to be that dad, and he couldn't, because once he knew what Hale was doing, he couldn't unknow it. He said the truth was like a splinter in his mind. It wouldn't let him rest until he pulled it out." Eli's voice had changed. It was steadier now, older. Not the voice of a frightened boy on a rally ground, but the voice of someone who had passed through something and come out carrying new weight that he was learning to bear. "He said one more thing," Eli continued. He said, "Find people who stand up when everyone else sits down. They're rare, but they're real, and when you find them, hold on." Eli reached out and took Ronan's hand, not the desperate clutching grip of the rally, the trembling fist on the leather sleeve, the white-knuckled hold of a child in freefall. This was different. This was deliberate, steady. the handshake of a young man who was choosing to acknowledge a debt that couldn't be repaid and wasn't asking to be. Ronan looked at the boy's hand in his, felt the warmth of it, felt the steadiness, felt, in that small point of contact, something he hadn't felt since Danny, the specific, irreplaceable sensation of being trusted by someone who had every reason not to trust anyone. "I only said I knew his face," Eli said, and he smiled. Not the broad, easy smile of a child without worries, but the quieter, harder smile of someone who had learned that the world was both terrible and survivable, and that the difference between the two was sometimes nothing more than a stranger's willingness to listen. "Sometimes that's all it takes," Ronan said, "for the truth to finally catch up." He let go of the boy's hand. Eli turned and walked back to his mother. Sarah looked up, saw Ronan across the room, and held his gaze for a moment that carried the weight of everything she would never be able to say. Gratitude too large for language, relief too deep for expression, the particular kind of love that exists between people who have been through the worst thing together and survived. She nodded. Once. Slowly. Ronan nodded back. Then he turned and walked out of the community center into the February afternoon. The sky was still blue, that impossible artificial blue that made the mountains look like they'd been painted. His bike was parked at the curb, chrome catching the winter sun, engine cold but waiting. Jude's bike was beside it. Pike's, Garrett's, Dex's, Dex. A line of Harleys along Main Street, angled into the curb like horses at a rail, patient and powerful and carrying the particular beauty of machines that had been ridden hard and maintained well. The brothers were scattered along the sidewalk, some leaning against their bikes, some sitting on the curb, some standing with coffee cups from the diner across the street, steam rising from the lids into the cold air. They looked like what they were, a group of men who had been through a war and were standing in the aftermath, not celebrating, not mourning, just existing in the space between what had happened and what would come next. Deck was sitting on his bike with his hands on his knees, staring at the road that led out of Ashridge toward the mountains. His face carried its years openly now, the scar, the lines, the gray hair, the accumulated evidence of a life spent building something from broken pieces. He looked tired. He looked old. He looked like a man who had paid a price he was still calculating. But he also looked like a man who was still here, still sitting on his bike, still wearing his vest, still occupying the chair at the head of a table that had lost one member and gained something harder to define, a renewed understanding of what the table meant and what it cost to sit at it. Ronan straddled his Harley. The leather seat was cold through his jeans. He pulled on his gloves, one finger at a time, the way he always did, slow, deliberate, the ritual of a man preparing to move. He turned the key. The engine caught on the first try. A sound that started as a rumble and built into a growl that vibrated through the frame and into his bones and up through his chest where Danny's dog tag sat against his skin, cold metal warming slowly, the dead keeping company with the living the way they always did. Jude pulled up beside him, Pike behind, Garrett, Dex, Deck. One by one, the iron veil fell into formation. The staggered column, the road captain at the front, the president at the rear. The Brotherhood arranged in the specific order that had been established years ago and would endure years more, despite betrayal, despite loss, despite the ongoing relentless erosion of everything the world threw at them. Ronan looked down Main Street, past the community center where a boy and his mother were drinking bad coffee and learning to breathe again, past the storefronts and the cracked sidewalks and the small, stubborn town that had nearly been hollowed out from the inside by a man in an expensive watch, past the mountains that stood on both sides like sentinels guarding a valley that didn't know it had been saved. He rolled the throttle. The engine answered. The bike moved forward, slow at first, then faster, the acceleration smooth and continuous, the road opening ahead like a sentence that had been waiting to be finished. Behind him, the column followed, 12 bikes in staggered formation, engines harmonizing into a single sustained chord that echoed off the buildings and carried through the streets, and rose into the cold blue sky where it mixed with the wind and the silence and the distant sound of a world that was still broken in 1,000 places. But was, in this one place, for this one moment, a little less broken than it had been yesterday. The road curved north. The town shrank in the mirrors, the mountains grew, and Ronan Voss rode point into the afternoon light, the way he always rode. Forward, scanning, carrying the weight of a compass rose with one missing point, heading in the only direction that mattered to a man who had stopped looking for home and started building it in the spaces between the people he protected and the road that never ended. The engines faded. The town went quiet, and somewhere inside the community center, a 13-year-old boy stood at a window and watched the last bike disappear around the bend, and he held his father's letter against his chest. And he understood, for the first time, with a clarity that would stay with him for the rest of his life, that the world was full of men who walked away and rare with men who stayed, and that the difference between the two was not courage or strength or fearlessness, but something simpler and harder and more enduring than any of those things. It was the decision to answer when someone reached out. It was the willingness to hold on.